Thank you. That's usually a good sign when everybody actually listens on the first announcement. So I appreciate that. It also is indicative of, I think, the kind of program we have actually put together today, because there's a lot of interest, obviously, in issues related to Brazil and the United States. Historically, very deep trading partners, also tremendous flows of foreign direct investment between the two countries. So there's a very strong relationship that is influenced by both politics and economics. And of course, that spills over into the energy sector. So we are fortunate enough to have a great selection of speakers that was put together by the tremendous group here at the Baker Institute and at the Brazil-Texas Chamber of Commerce to discuss all of these issues. So I'm really looking forward to the program, and I'm sure you will get a lot out of it. A couple of just very basic housekeeping notes I want to make before I pass the podium along to Carla Lacerda. Restrooms are on either side of me. Men's is on that side behind the stage. Women's is on this side. There are no fire drills planned for today, so if you hear any alarms, please take it seriously. The muster points are out the front door by the fountain, which is where most of you sort of came into the building, or through either one of these back doors in the street behind the building. So again, nothing's planned, but if you do hear an alarm, just in a very orderly fashion, proceed to those locations. The conference today is hopefully the first of many. Carla and I have had some conversations sort of leading up to this event. We have, here at the Baker Institute, a long history of doing work with institutions in Brazil. It's one of my favorite countries in the world to visit. I often tell people that in Rio, for example, where I've been many, many times, it has its own beat. And I think for those of you who are from the region might understand what I mean, but it's a remarkable place, very vibrant, lots of potential, both tapped and untapped, that spell tremendous fortune for the country. And it being in the Western Hemisphere with the United States and sharing a very deep and long trading history, it presents tremendous opportunities for partnership in different dimensions. We see this in the energy sector without a doubt, which is really what I focus on here at the Baker Institute, but it spills over into all aspects of politics and economy, and I think you're going to hear a lot of that today. So with that, I am going to pass the podium over to Carla Lacerda. She's the president of BRATECC, and I'm sure she's going to have much more eloquent remarks to make than I about this event. But please enjoy the day. Carla.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Ken, for the warm welcome. And thank you to the Baker Institute and the Center of Energy Studies, because this is a fantastic opportunity for us at BRATECC. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Carla Lacerda, president of BRATECC, and it's a pleasure to be here. What I would like, our mission at BRATECC is really to foster relationships, bilateral relationships between the Brazil and the United States. And being in the city of Houston, and particularly because of the focus on energy, is a wonderful opportunity for us to do so. And the partnership with institutions like Baker Institute is what really enables us to do that even more. And so we're looking forward to continuing this journey. We have a tremendous year ahead of us. It's certainly not going to be a boring year. We've already seen that. But what I would really like to do is just explain a bit about the genesis of this event. Really, it all began with an idea of a young lady sitting here in the audience, Paula Gallardo. So, Paula, we took your idea and we ran with it. Paula was the one that really provided us the outline of the framework of having a Brazil summit. And then, in a conversation with Benigna Leis from the Center of Energy Studies, the idea matured, and then we then had an opportunity to bridge with Baker and Ken and his team. So all of this came together really by a team of 4 people initially working closely together. So the 3 of us and Francisco, where's Francisco? Francisco Monaldi. And it leads me to think about a quote from an anthropologist called Margaret Mead: "Never underestimate the power of a group of small group of dedicated people to make a difference." And the four of you and the four of us has made a difference in really enabling this event to happen. So thank you very much. And really the focus of this is really to provide an opportunity in the early part of the year to think about what are some of the key aspects of the Brazil business community that's happening. So today you will hear initially the panel about the political, which will be moderated by Francisco. So you'll hear kind of a bigger, broader picture about what's going on in politics. Lots happening right now, and I'm sure the speakers are going to address this. Following that will be an economic discussion. So we'll talk about the big picture of the economy and then some specifics about the tax reform. There will be a break. And then we will have a really interesting energy panel moderated by Benigna for getting to the closure of the event. We'd like to thank you very much for your presence. Thank you for coming so early. I really appreciate that, but because we have so much good material to share. And then lastly, I would like to thank the sponsors of this event, Asterix Partner with Roberto Ribeiro. I don't know where Roberto is, he's in the back. Thank you, Roberto. And also Enerflex with Carlo Frontin. Thank you very much, Carlos, and we appreciate the sponsorship and the support of your companies. So with that, I would like to hand over to Francisco Monaldi as the moderator of the political panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carla. It is a pleasure to be with you. Here are the panelists, Brian Winter and Tiago Dragao. Just go ahead. So today we are going to start with the politics of Brazil. Of course, being in Houston and being part of the Center on Energy Studies here at the Baker Institute, we are very much interested in tying everything to the energy sector. But in order to understand what might happen to the energy sector in Brazil, of course, we need to understand what might happen in the politics of Brazil. By the way, I forgot to mention, I am the director of the Latin American Energy Program here at the Center for Energy Studies at the Baker Institute. And we have a great pair of panelists today. I am super happy and excited that they both came here. Brian Winter, the editor-in-chief of the Americas Quarterly. For those that don't know, that is, to me, today the best magazine covering current affairs and politics and economics in the region. It's published by the Council of the Americas. And Tiago Dragao is one of the most respected political risk analysts in the region, particularly focusing on Brazil, but he has moved to the US and now has a more broader sort of look of the world. And very interestingly, Tiago has become one of the top experts on the relationship between China and Latin America, which is, of course, something that we want to talk about. Just to frame our discussion a little bit, Brazil is, of course, an energy powerhouse. It's unmistakable that, that it has become one of the biggest players, not only in hydrocarbons, of course, oil production. Brazil is the largest oil producer in the region, something that when I started, looking at these issues 3 decades ago, looked like very implausible. Venezuela and Mexico being at the time the largest producers by far. In fact, at the very beginning of oil exploitation in Brazil, there were very little expectations that it will ever be a big player. But not only that, it's a big player in biofuels. It has one of the most, the greenest energy matrices in the world. It's pretty impressive. advances in terms of energy transition compared to at least some of its peers in the region. At the same time, of course, that sort of half full or more than half full story has a lot of missed potential. Always the phrase about Brazil being the country of the future, and you can even see it in the oil sector itself. It should be producing much more oil than it's producing today if they had the right policies, and if the politics of Brazil had not been and the macro not as sort of volatile and polarized in the last decade or more. So let me start with Brian. Let's give us a sort of an assessment of what is the political moment in Brazil like today. Of course, President Lula has had some health issues. He seems to have recovered, but of course he's like in the U.S., an older guy in power, and so everyone has to talk about health issues and life expectancy. There is, of course, the issue of Mr. Bolsonaro, which it's hanging around, and eventually we might talk about Trump. The polarization of the country is not a phenomenon only of Brazil, but that we have seen in other places in the world, including in the U.S. And of course, we are all thinking what will happen in 2026 if the Lula is going to be reelected. His numbers are relatively in a space in which typically presidents get reelected, but at the same time there are some clouds and So give us sort of your perspective, Brian, on how do you see the political moment, what are the challenges, and what are your expectations for the next year and maybe including the 2026 elections?
Francisco, thank you so much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to share a space with you and Thiago, who I respect and admire very much. I want to say just first how incredibly happy I am to be here. I grew up in Dallas. I'm a graduate of the University of Texas. I lived several years in Sao Paulo, and Brazil is my main focus. So when I got an invitation from the Brazil-Texas Chamber of Commerce, obviously I was going to accept. It's a very, I'm so happy to be here, especially at this time when the world is changing, not just by the day, but by the hour. So look, my view of Brazil under Lula is that it is stable, but trending slightly downward, meaning the first 2 years of this government have been okay, especially in a global context like the one that we see right now, where things are so volatile. The economy has grown better than 3% for the last 3 years. It has consistently outperformed expectations during that time. President Lula's approval ratings have been broadly stable at around 50%, which in today's world is pretty high. 50% today is what 70% was a generation ago, especially in a country that, like our country and so many others around the hemisphere, around the world, are so polarized. But it's a government that has also had its difficulties. I think it's fair to say that he is running a center-left government in a country that is now firmly center-right in terms of its overall zeitgeist and politics. It's a significantly more conservative country today than it was 20 years ago when he was president for the first time. And you see that in recent municipal elections, as well as in the broad array of forces in Congress, where again, the sort of center point is clearly to the right of center. That has all acted as kind of a brake on power for Lula. And as a result, my sense as someone who's been following Lula for the better part of 20 years is that he is not having as much fun this time as he did when he was president the first time. Because first of all, there's no commodities boom. And then, like there was during the 2000s when he was president, that was led by China. Everybody in here knows that story. But also he's not as connected with the Brazilian public. I think he understands that the country's more conservative. And let me talk about that for a second. Maybe these are statistics that people in here know. I assume we have a broadly Brazilian room today. Is that right? How many Brazilians are here today, if you can? Right, okay. But some who maybe don't follow as closely on a day-to-day basis and may not be as aware of some of these changes. In the 1980s, 7% of the Brazilian population was made up of evangelical Christians in a country that, of course, was always Roman Catholic. In fact, the world's biggest Roman Catholic country, still is today. But that 7% number back in the 1980s, today that number is about 35%. That is an amazing transition in just the span of a generation. And anybody who lives in the United States and in Texas sort of understands the impact that that has had on politics. It has had an impact on the way people feel about their government, on the way they feel about their day-to-day lives, their values, and so on. So that number is 35% today, but the IBGE, which is Brazil's National Statistics Institute, says that the country may actually become majority evangelical Christian by 2035. And so, nobody knows for sure, but it's a transition that continues at a very rapid pace. I think Lula, being the most talented politician of his generation, is smart enough to understand that that is creating major impacts in the country. He has told his party that they need to better connect with that community, with people who are out there in the day-to-day. But because he comes from a different generation and in many ways a different world, he hasn't really been able to, again, this idea of connecting. He's not as plugged in to the day-to-day feeling of most Brazilians as he was during his first term 20 years ago. There have also been some structural changes, which maybe we can get into, where Congress has a lot more power over the purse strings than it did when he was president the first time. There are also, as you mentioned, Francisco, these questions about his health. I'm not sure he will run again for re-election in 2026. There are increasing speculation and sort of the way the Brazilian press works, like it's never clear who exactly is saying what, but my sense is that this idea that he will not run again is beginning to kind of percolate in Brasilia and within his party. So it's an interesting scenario, and I think, to just finish, when I said that the economy in particular is trending down, there's this whole fiscal question, which again, I think we can get into maybe later in our discussion, but that is a real source of concern for Congress, for the investment community, for energy investors in particular, because it has so much of a chance to be broadly destabilizing. So again, in conclusion, I think stable, but you sense a country that is in transition and where some of these worries about the economy may serve as a drag, especially as we get into later this year and into the election year in 2026.
Great, thank you, Brian. Tiago, how do you see the moment, and do you have any sort of differences or things that you want to add to that picture that Brian is presenting?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Great to be with Brian. I also admire a lot your work as well. We have been together at the San Diego for a while. Well, I think one of the most important points that we have to focus and corroborating what Brian just explained to us, is that first, Brazil is a parliamentary system disguised as a presidentialist system. Yeah. So at the end of the day, the ultimate decision-making belongs to Congress. And Congress is ever more powerful. And the responsibility of actions is diluted among several. So we always have this tendency when reading the Brazilian press of hearing the Centrão, the centrist bloc does this. The centrist bloc is so different among themselves, in which they are very, very good to organize themselves to request, but they're not necessarily very good to execute as a bloc. And I think the second premise that we have also to observe is regarding polarization. Polarization is the organization of, especially in this day and age, is the organization of individuals around what they hate, not necessarily around what they love. And your ability to find a point of convergence when hatred or exclusion or rejection are the main drivers of your view as a group becomes very slim. And hatred is usually linked to power or to demonstration of strength. And even in our personal lives, when we say, I hate, it always comes with a demonstration of strength. So this strength caused by the way polarization is organized in Brazil solidifies and sediments much more the groups and prevents those groups from finding convergences. And the only way in specific polarized environments like in Brazil right now to find a convergence is through cash. Cash is the only convergence of groups that dislike each other. Okay, how do you do cash? You do cash through parliamentary amendments. And the way to govern like this is basically negotiating with Congress that they will not execute the powers they have to isolate you further as a president. And in exchange, you will allow them to share, and slightly pending on their side, how the executive, the decision-making from the executive. So this tilt of power is something that it's extremely important in Brazil. And it's something that Lula, one of the biggest symbols of how traditionally Brazilians see power, which is very personalistic, he does not understand that this is not about him anymore.
Right.
Lula is a symbol. And Lula represents personalization of politics. When you talk to Lula in a one-to-one, he does not invoke any phrase from the left. He starts to become more leftist when a second person joins the room, then a third, then 5, then 10, and by the time you have 1,000, he's super leftist. But Lula, he was a negotiator. He was someone that negotiated with the companies as a union leader in a way that the companies liked to negotiate with him because they found also a middle ground. Lula thrives only trying to find convergence in an environment in which convergence does not function in the same way that it functioned in Lula 1 and Lula 2, and he's lost. We often mistake political crisis with institutional crisis. An institutional crisis is a house that has its foundations falling apart. And that's not the case in Brazil. No. The house is fine, the hydraulic system, the energy system, the Wi-Fi connection, but if the family is dysfunctional, then it's a political crisis. And this dysfunctionality is because of the reorganization of where power and decision-making lies. And this is something that, as Brian put very well, Lula has a major problem in acknowledging, understanding, and realizing that it was a specific conjecture that led him to victory and not his view of the world that led him to victory.
Right.
And I think this is one of the major challenges that he finds right now. It's one of the major challenges that he is suffering from the Alejandro Toledo problem, which many of you don't know. Alejandro Toledo was a Peruvian president in the beginning of the past decade that had the GDP growth of the country was higher than his popularity. And this is how you detach politics from economy. And in a way, we have Lula with decent results. Unemployment is low, growth is there, but this cannot be translated because it's not about him anymore. Perception is not centralized. Perception is diluted. and Congress knows how to play this and distribute this idea in a way that Lula doesn't understand yet.
So it's your point of view that the numbers that Lula has, as Brian suggested, besides perhaps AMLO in Mexico, which Mexico seems to have always higher sort of approval ratings, is not a bad number from what I see, 49, 50%. Typically in the world, presidents get reelected with that number. But you suggest that he should have had better numbers because of the economy of, how do you interpret that?
First, these numbers are great, but these numbers, they are the numbers of a polarized era. So you have a lot of content within this number that is out of exclusion of the alternative. Okay. And when you break down this number, you have, he suffered in specific areas that historically he didn't. In the last poll, the support from women dropped, the support from women from the Northeast dropped, the support from people from the Northeast with lower income dropped. So he's not being able to translate in a way that he did in the past. And we have also to see, and as Brian mentioned, it was a different era. Lula could call the president of the central bank and ask him to lower the interest rates. Right now, it's not how it works. It's not even the responsibility of the president to choose how the interest rates. You have a group of directors. You have Congress that their support to you is not endorsing your ideas, is avoiding problems to you. It's like pay for protection. So these are dynamics that a personalistic president like Lula has major difficulties in understanding. And he does not understand that the automatic economic results will not be translated or cashed in immediately for popularity. Sure. And of course, we won't have 70%. If you see a poll of anyone in the world that shows 80%, I wouldn't trust that poll.
Yeah, we live in a different world in that regard. Brian, I wanted to bring of course, the election of Donald Trump, that even though Brazil is probably not one of the first countries that you think would be impacted compared to, of course, Mexico.
Neither was Panama.
Exactly. well, although people who know Trump know that he's obsessed with Panama, I think we should find out if he had any trouble with Brazil at some point in his life. But of course, it could matter, right? Clearly, President Trump and President Lula are not in the same ideological wave or personality or many differences. And of course, President Trump had a good relationship with Bolsonaro that not necessarily materialized in any, as far as I understand, in any really policy that helped Brazil, but it could impact if, for example, Bolsonaro is in prison or not allowed to run. It might be that President Trump gets involved. And of course, now we have Mr. Musk, who also likes to get involved in the politics of other countries, including, of course, Brazil. So how do you think the Trump presidency might impact Brazil? Is it going to make Brazil even closer to Europe with the Mercosur deal, et cetera? And are we in for maybe one or two surprises like Panama, as you mentioned?
Look, I think a storm is coming. I think that Lula and Trump are on a collision course, and it's just a question of time until we see the first tweet with Lula's name in it. And there's a couple reasons why, and how bad it will be, how dramatic it will be, I sort of go back and forth. Thiago, maybe you debate a little bit on this too. I go back and forth between believing that President Trump won't have that much time for Brazil, and believing that Brazil is actually in some ways the perfect low-cost target for President Trump. There's no doubt that he has people who are in his inner circle who do not like Lula's Brazil. You mentioned Elon Musk. with all the, the confrontation that Elon Musk had with the Brazilian Supreme Court over political speech issues last year. That was a confrontation that Elon Musk lost, and I'm sure that it left him with a bad taste in his mouth. But he's not the only member of Donald Trump's inner circle who has a negative view of Brazil currently. Steve Bannon has a lot of connectivity to the Bolsonaro family, specifically Eduardo Bolsonaro. But it's not just him. Jason Miller, who's a very important figure in Trump world, made a visit to Brazil in 2022 where he was briefly detained on an airplane at the order of Alexandre de Moraes, the Brazilian Supreme Court judge who was also at the center of the controversy with Elon Musk over X and political speech. Add to that a group of very influential people who are part of the Bolsonarista movement who live in South Florida and have spent the last several years telling people in Trump world, going to Mar-a-Lago, and telling them that Brazil is just as bad as Venezuela. That's not true. But are there, legitimate questions around these issues of political speech? Yes. And the point is, regardless of what I believe, has an impression been created in the minds of President Trump and some others that Brazil is something of a socialist, rogue, less than democratic state? Yes, that is what they believe. And so, I believe that at some point President Trump will put Lula and maybe Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes in his crosshairs. And that could involve threatening sanctions, maybe revoking visas. I don't think that he will fully unload his cannon in the way that he threatened to do against Colombian President Gustavo Petro a couple of weeks ago. But there are other strategic issues that could make things complicated for Brazil, and one of them is BRICS. We know specifically that President Trump has the issue of BRICS, and specifically a BRICS currency, prominent on his radar. As a coincidence, I believe that Brazil is the president of the BRICS group this year, and hosting, I think that's right as well. So that's another thing that puts Brazil on the radar. And we've all seen, just in the span of the last, how long has it been? 15 days? 15 years? Just what can happen when you are put in that focus. It has an effect on financial markets, it has an effect on business confidence. In a country where confidence is already receding somewhat among the investor community because of these fiscal issues, and specifically the disappointment over the fiscal package that the government announced back in November. So yeah, we'll see, and trying to assess what President Trump might do from one minute to another is notoriously difficult. But we saw in the case of Colombia, in the words of a Panamanian businessman who was watching all this as it unfolded 8 days ago, he said, Trump just showed us his arsenal. And the idea that he could use something similar to that against Brazil as an inducement to convince the Brazilian establishment to let Jair Bolsonaro run in the 2026 elections, for example, or as an inducement to allow Jair Bolsonaro to travel internationally, which he was forbidden from doing. He was invited to President Trump's inauguration, but he was not allowed to attend, again by an order of the Brazilian Supreme Court. So I think the temptation for him to intervene will be quite strong. And if he passes some of these sanctions, Brazil is a big and important country, and everybody in this room knows that, but the amount of trade with the United States is not especially large. It's not like starting a trade war with Mexico, for example. That implies a heavy cost to the United States, an immediate cost to the US. In the case of Brazil, it's not as much, and that's why I think in some ways it's a quote-unquote perfect target. It's a prominent figure of the global left, with all the nuances that Thiago mentioned, who he can spar with verbally from a clear position of strength.
By the way, you have cards in your tables, and if you want to write questions, please do so, and I will get them. Please signal to somebody to pick pick up the questions, and at the end I will bring some of these questions in. Thiago, I wanted to sort of, you can of course give also your views on this, but I wanted to connect this with the role of China, right? One of the, of course, obsessions of President Trump is China and the rivalry with China. And of course, China has very important ties with Brazil. You know, it's the biggest market for the exports, agricultural exports, etc. And the role of China in the region in the last decade or two has been very different from the past, much more assertive, much more. The Chinese have really, you know, gotten into influencing the policy in countries in the region in a way that wasn't the case before. And of course, the Chinese seem to have to offer much more things than the Americans that have little to offer, and these days don't even offer a free trade agreement, which was sort of the biggest draw that the U.S. offered in the past. So what are your views on the role that China is playing in Brazil? How might that impact the relation between Brazil and the U.S. and broader role in the world? As Brian mentioned, we have this year, Brazil is in the focus of the world, right? The COP meeting in Belém, the G20, what you mentioned about the BRICS, that clearly President Trump has antipathy. The other day he brought Spain into the BRICS, which is not part of the BRICS. He said that they should go out, but they are not in. But anyways, it is really? Clearly, yes.
I missed that.
It's hard to keep up with.
Well, every action, it's a bit contradictory, several of the actions that Trump does in relation to Latin America, which makes us shift around what his priorities are. Naturally, his phrases over the past 2 weeks, they serve very well to Beijing. Most of the actions lately, they end up pushing Latin America closer to China than anything else. And I think one of the things that we must observe related to that is that historically, or at least in the past 30 years, 20 years, the agenda of the United States to Latin America is an agenda of problems and negative issues. The components of the agenda are illegal immigration, narco-trafficking, lack of transparency, corruption, the triangle border Venezuela-Cuba, border Venezuela-Cuba, border Venezuela-Cuba. And of course, there are several positive connections and strong and solid connections that come mostly from the private sector. So China understood that and came with an opposite agenda of cooperation. I give you lines of credit to this. And naturally, the US comes alerting some of those nations in Latin America that this is not as good as it seems, this entangling, but still fails to offer a strong alternative for that. So at the end of the day, what ends up happening is that it's not a matter of preference. It's a matter of the only choice you have. The United States does not bring to the table the same type of alternatives. And China will become stronger in Latin America during the next 4 years. I assure that. Because the only way to match that is splashing money, and polarized societies do not allow you to do that with the same strength. How are you going to justify to the voters in Iowa that you're splashing money in Ecuador to prevent the presence of China or the influence of China in specific areas or specific sectors in there? China does not necessarily operate with the goal of conquering the influence of the country. This sometimes is an outcome. The most important thing is how dependency is developed. We have countries such as Brazil, which is commercially dependent on China. We have others, such as Venezuela, who are financially dependent on China. We have also Argentina, who is commercial and financially dependent on China. So despite Milei's narrative, if you go to the website of the Chinese government of their last meeting, he's endorsing strongly one China. He's not going to fight that. Bolsonaro said that during the campaign, but didn't fight that. Dependency, even in our personal lives, creates an asymmetric relationship. And this asymmetric relationship benefits one side over the other. I believe that many of the Latin American countries, when they look at the United States, many of them lost the will to pursue something that they believed it would come easy at the end of the Cold War. When the narrative was democracy will invariably bring economic prosperity. So all countries becoming democratic, expecting free trade agreements and closer proximity to the United States, but that didn't turn out to be the case. Because the metric of a successful democracy didn't belong to them. And the same expectation towards China was flawed by the US, that economic prosperity will invariably bring democracy. It's not quite like that. China is an animal of its own. But one of the main things in there is that China understands that dependency can be eventually translated to policy. When we look a year and a half ago, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, and UAE, Qatar, and 5 others signed a letter saying that there are no human rights abuses in Xinjiang, in the Muslim province in Western China. This is a direct result of dependency. Direct result of dependency. And I believe that in Latin America, when you have certain countries, and you just see the past votings that are against China in the major multilateral forums, those countries that are dependent, they either put themselves neutral, they do not vote, or they vote in favor. Rarely, and very rarely, they vote against. And a final example, one very good example of that is Bolsonaro during his administration, in which he claimed during several months that Huawei would not be a supplier of the 5G kit for the new telecom bidding for the new 5G network being installed in Brazil. Absolutely no way, there are backdoors in Huawei's kit, and he was adamant on that. And Trump telling him not to allow Huawei to participate. But ultimately, all it took was one phone call from Beijing. One phone call. Of course, at the time, Brazil needed some active pharmaceutical ingredients to expand the production of CoronaVac. But all this phone call did was put Huawei in the game. And Huawei is there. And the same happens every couple of months in minor issues, in medium issues, in minor issues. The dependency operates. And to break this dependency, it requires full cooperation, which is not necessarily the environment that we have right now, as Brian shared with us.
Go ahead, Brian.
I would just briefly, I think these events are always more interesting when there's a little bit of disagreement among the panelists.
Sure.
And I see things a little bit differently, and maybe as an American, you're free to sort of judge my perspective based on where I come from. But I've been thinking about this question a lot, even over the last 2 weeks, with all the noise that we've seen and the clashes and tensions with countries in Latin America that have been considered allies of the United States, for a long time. And this idea that countries will be pushed further into the arms of Beijing is an idea that's circulating a lot. I question it, and I question it for a couple of reasons. One of them being is that China's presence in the region it's not receding, but the finance has cratered. The investment is also down, and we all know the demographic problems, the economic problems, and the problems that the Chinese quote-unquote private sector has had over the last few years as the Premier Xi Jinping has tightened control over that. I don't want to, I know that this is not a China, US, Latin America panel, but I do think that when you think about Brazil's trajectory, it's important to consider this. Brazilians are one of the most pro-US peoples in the world. If you look at polling that's done by the Pew Research Center and others, the US consistently scores very high, and I don't see much demand from society at large for an alignment with Beijing. What you see is demand for an alignment with the United States. And when I look at the political elections, when I look at the elections that are likely to happen over the next couple of years, if you look at Chile later this year, it's almost, I wouldn't say certain, but odds are very good that the right will come back into power. I think you can say the same of upcoming elections in Peru as well as in Colombia in 2026. And we'll get into, I think all things being equal, if it's not, especially if Lula doesn't run again, we're likely to see a right-of-center leader take office in Brazil in 2026 as well. And so that, to me, suggests that over time, even with this instability that we're seeing out of Washington and these clashes even with some of our allies, I see a tendency that is drifting more toward Washington and perhaps away from Beijing. Of course, these countries will continue to trade with China, just as the United States does. But in terms of investment in strategic assets such as ports, which became a main subject of discussion, not just with this controversy over the Panama Canal, but with the threats that the Trump administration has made to put tariffs on imports coming in through the new Chinese port of Chancay in Peru. I think that there will be more and more pressure from this administration not to accept investment in some of those strategic assets, even if countries continue to trade.
Just a final point here, and I agree with you in terms of how interesting it becomes when we disagree. I disagree. And one of the reasons is the cycle of financing is not the same at all the times. Of course, China began with a specific cycle of financing, which shifted to a sign of, to a period of acquiring percentage of the companies that used to be financed, which shifted in the past 3 years to participation in startups with focus in São Paulo, Argentina, Medellin, and Guadalajara. The dependency was established already in some countries, to the point that Chinese steel being dumped in Brazil does not and cannot generate reactions from the Brazilian government against China. The functioning of the Chinese economy is one that you must maintain economic industrial activity at a very high pace, independently of local absorption or not. If you keep the production exactly or strongly at high pace, what you do if you cannot absorb that, you dump. So a lot of the iron ore that is exported to China, it does not necessarily remain at China anymore because of their housing market problems. And one of the key things is that, of course, we have a cultural affinity with the US, but it's becoming more prohibitive for people in Latin America to come to the US.
That's true.
In the 80s, in the 90s, you could work a couple years, 3-4 years, and come study here. The cost of a university here is prohibitive to Latin Americans. To get a visa is very difficult as well. So one of the points is that China operates a lot with tech as soft power. As soon as Ford left, BYD is there, and BYD have problems which are disgusting in their factory there regarding specific forced work. But this is a trend that you will see more and more BYD rather than Ford, rather than General Motors in those countries, and more Huawei phones, more Xiaomi phones, and an entire generation, just like it happened with the Japanese in the 70s, that are going to look at those products within the next 10, 15 years and associate to reliability and trustworthiness.
Yeah, no, I want to, because we don't have that much more time, and I need to include some questions. I think this is a fascinating topic that we could, have a whole panel on, not only on Brazil and China, but on, as you point out, on China. And I go back and forth between both sort of positions, in the sense that I think there is data, in both sides of how China's role is increasing or not. But the cultural things, I think, are also important. There are a few questions, and I want to connect it also to the economics and energy, about who might win the next election in Brazil. Who are the front runners, or would be the front runners? What happens if Lula doesn't run, or if he runs? How likely is he to win? But also, I wanted to connect that with the issue of the economy, right? We had a major devaluation. As you pointed out, markets are a little bit jittery because of the fiscal reform. And there is the possibility that if Lula feels that his numbers, say, if policies in the U.S. are inflationary, and that leads to more inflation also in Brazil, tighter, the central bank does not do whatever Lula wants him to do, it could become a little bit more dangerous for Lula in terms of re-election prospects, or even his candidate to win, and he might become more populist. So how do you see this playing out, and who do you think might be the biggest contenders for the presidency? Perhaps starting with you, Brian.
It's a lot of questions. Age is undefeated. And I think it's hard enough to be president of a country, any country, but a country like Brazil at any age, and particularly at 78 or 79, which is what Lula is now. There's a temptation sometimes in the United States to see parallels between what happens in our country and what happens elsewhere. And I've spent the better part of my career trying to resist that temptation. But in the case of Brazil, there have been some parallels in the last 7 or 8 years that get a little bizarre sometimes, and that people in Brazil end up noticing as well. And so, of course, the experience of what happened with Joe Biden in this country has an impact on the public imagination and on the way the political class is seeing things in Brazil. And this spectacle of a president who had, maybe it's in bad taste to say these things so directly, but I think it's important as part of this conversation. The report is that he was in the shower clipping his toenails, and he fell, and he had severe bleeding from the back of his head, and he was out of commission for more than a week as a result. And those are the kinds of episodes that come to sort of public knowledge and that make people question whether that. And I want to be really clear about something. My impression as somebody who follows Lula very closely is that he has the appearance of far more physical energy and acuity than President Biden did in his final months. I mean, he seems like somebody who's still very strong. But he's had these setbacks. He knows he's a little bit out of sync with the country. He had this moment in November where he, after the first 2 years of the government where the market was waiting for them to announce this fiscal adjustment, watching the Brazilian government spend too much, watching these debt to GDP numbers heading in the wrong direction, and being assured by the finance minister and others that the moment would come where they would really tighten up. And then the moment came, and it underperformed people's expectations, and that's part of the reason why the real was one of the worst performing currencies anywhere in the world in 2024. And there seems to be kind of a lingering pall on investor sentiment as we start off 2025. So Francisco, to your question of like who would be the candidates, on the left, if Lula were not to run, I mean, I'm curious to hear you on this. I suspect that they would try the finance minister, Fernando Haddad, but he ran in 2018 and was not did not come close to winning. Bolsonaro won the runoff, I believe, by 12 percentage points, isn't that right? Under circumstances that were very different. But it's not clear that Haddad even has the support of his own party. On the right, now this is an interesting question. Jair Bolsonaro wants to be candidate again, or gives the impression of wanting to be the candidate again. He is currently disqualified from being a candidate until 2030 because of, among other things, his questioning of the election in 2022. There is a huge pressure campaign in Brasilia to get that ban lifted. I would be surprised if it was lifted, but Lula's own story shows that you should never count anybody out in Brazilian politics. I think Lula has actually even said that himself in a remarkable moment of self-awareness. So if it wasn't Jair Bolsonaro, a lot of speculation is centered around Tarcísio de Freitas, who's the governor of Sao Paulo. The business community in Sao Paulo and I think here in the United States would be delighted with a Tarcísio de Freitas candidate because they see in someone who perhaps could bring some of the best economic ideas from Jair Bolsonaro's time in office, but without some of the volatility. But in part for that reason, it seems sometimes like the sort of core members of the Bolsonarista movement do not trust Tarcísio de Freitas. They see him as a bit bland, as not a true believer in this kind of new Brazilian right. And as a consequence of that, we may end up seeing someone else from the Bolsonaro family run. There's speculation around one of his sons, perhaps Flavio, perhaps Eduardo. There's even speculation that it could be the former First Lady, Michelle, although maybe there's some issues there as well, which is all a very long-winded way of saying it's kind of wide open. And we don't know who the candidates would be. All we know, and kind of the compass that I sort of set my sights by, is that, again, if you have a car with a steering wheel, the alignment is pointing right. And so that's where I suspect the energy will be in the next election, but who the candidates actually are is something of a mystery.
Do you have a short comment on that?
Yeah, the Workers' Party is working with Haddad as the name, okay, and this is one of the, if he eventually leaves the Ministry of Finance, one of the ideas for him to go to the Casa Civil, because that's the only two positions that a presidential name could occupy in this administration. We have to see how Lula's position will be, but the Workers' Party always made a mistake of allowing Lula to be much bigger than the party. So it was very limiting for new names to come up. With Bolsonaro, he is doing everything he can for his son and his wife, but their rejection rates are extremely high. Eduardo Bolsonaro's rejection rate is the same as Haddad, 55%. Michelle Bolsonaro's rejection rate is 52%. That means that she has a ceiling of 48 if she gets all the votes she can get. So, of course, it's too soon, but this is one of these situations. Tarcísio is not very, is not 100% comfortable yet with the idea of running. He's someone who is a recent converter to the right. He used to be a very trustworthy minister or executive secretary during Dilma administration, very close to Dilma at that time, and he became Bolsonarista. Within the left, we also have slowly Elder Barbalho trying to become a name in case Haddad becomes as a not viable option. And he became very close to Lula while organizing for the COP and trying to put the state of Pará support to the executive in a very strong way. So Elder Barbalho is a name that his ambition is to at least be the vice presidential candidate in a more center-left type of coordination and combination. And then we have other traditional names as always. Ronaldo Caiado, the senator from Goiás, who wants to be a very strong leader from the agro sector, but he still does not have the reach, although his rejection rate is very low. So that indicates that there is a large margin for him to work as well.
For those of you who investors, you may be listening to all this and thinking like, what on earth does this fragmented field mean? And I would think that in a broad sense, it means a certain stability. You don't have a radical candidate in that field who's likely to be able to take policy in a dramatically different direction under any of these circumstances. I mean, do you agree with that?
No. No, I agree with you. I agree with you. We don't. Yeah. And I agree with you that it is. It demonstrates that you do not have a clear path in which the political heritage is easily transmitted to one another.
Right.
And I think that this goes back to the initial argument of how the power of Congress.
Yeah.
The power of Congress dilutes the perception of an individual to be the president as it was in the past. When Itamar Franco was president and Fernando Henrique Cardoso was the Minister of Finance, everyone knew. Everyone knew the plan. The plan was very simple there. And then we also had on the other side Lula, because everything was concentrated in the executive. This is not the case anymore. The most powerful individuals in the country today are Hugo Mota and Davi Alcolumbre, President of the House, and Speaker of the House, and President of the Senate. The names will even be based on how the Centrão and the Centrão parties will react as potential allies. They will vet names from both sides, saying, if you come with Eduardo Bolsonaro, these four parties here, the Centrão, won't support you. And that's enough for the name to be gone.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I think this has been a fascinating panel, and we will continue the discussion of these topics in the economics panel and then in the energy panel. I just wanted to say that, for someone who looks at this, I'm not a Brazilian specialist, but looks at the region as a whole, I do tend to think of the glass half full in Brazil, in the sense, as you pointed out, about the institutional sort of foundations of Brazil compared to other countries in the region. I think it's very frustrating for many people, how politics worked in Brazil through Congress, etc. But that does give some stability compared to other countries in the region. And there are some institutions, that in Brazil that work than in other countries in the regions. Clearly, we don't have or don't work, particularly when we talk about the energy sector. Of course, there are plenty of concerns and plenty of worries that we will talk about probably in the economic panel too. But I feel, that overall Brazil is in a better position than other countries in the region.
I liked something that Lula said during the campaign in 2022 when they asked him about polarization in Brazil. And he said, do you know where there is no polarization? China. Which was
is
interesting on several levels.
Which is not even that right.
Yeah, but compared to, certainly, I think you'd agree,
No,
certainly more
Lula's
suppressed.
mindset, yeah.
Well,
With that, let's give some applause to our panelists. And now we move to the economic panel that will be moderated by Carla Lacerda. Carla, please come and
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. If you could please take the seats. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, Francisco and Thiago and Brian, fascinating panel that we had right before. Certainly that was one of the goals of today, was really to talk about what was happening in Brazil and impact of US elections. So in this panel now, we are going to talk about the economic aspects of Brazil. Now, most of you that are sitting here represent investors or advisors to investors, or maybe people that are looking at public policy that ultimately become part of the decision-making process for investment opportunities. And as we heard in the panel before, the glass half full reference, sometimes, and I was in charge of running a company in Brazil for several years, and it felt like my work was being on a roller coaster, but a nice roller coaster with padded seats and seat belts and headrests, because it is. There are ups and downs, and in most countries that we work, there are always ups and downs. And so today is really an opportunity to really look at that, at the economic aspects. And I would like to introduce our two speakers. Here, Will Landers. He is managing partner for BTG Pactual in New York City, where he leads third-party fund team. He's also president of the Brazil American Chamber of Commerce based in New York City, which is where I met him. Formerly, he was with BlackRock, doing a lot of work in Latin America. And you're also working significantly with a nonprofit organization called Brazil Foundation, Will. So great work, great work. It's very nice to see. Mário Prada is here to my right. He's partner with Matos Filho, law firm based in Rio de Janeiro. He is a specialist in tax matters, particularly looking at structuring and implementing projects. A specialist in oil and gas from upstream to downstream, so vast experience across the value chain. It'd be really nice to hear your perspective, Mário. And you have been recognized by over several years by the Latin Lawyer 250 and the Legal 500, amongst others. So it's a pleasure having both of you here. And I'm going to begin the conversation with Will. As we look at Brazil in the last year, we've seen, and in our preliminary session, Will told me, Carla, you're giving me the hard job. And says, yeah, well, we have to start here, right? But as we look at Brazil in the last year, we had devaluation of the real of 30%. We have some of the highest interest rates in Brazil. We're having some of the fiscal issues that are going on now. We already talked about the politics. We have coming up on the world scene, obviously, there are some fiscal aspects of the impact of the US elections. So, Will, could you give us a perspective in all of that? Because there are opportunities as well, right, in addition to all of these issues. So, please, if you could let us know.
Well, first of all, good morning, Carla. It's a pleasure to be here with you. We had BRATECC at the Brazil Chamber in New York last year, so it's a pleasure to be able to be here with you in Texas as well, and thanks to the Baker Institute as well for having us here. My name doesn't sound it, but I'm Brazilian by birth, born and raised in São Paulo, so I'm a Paulista, Paulistano, São Paulino. And I spent most of my career at BlackRock traveling the world telling people why they should be investing in Brazil, why they should be investing in Latin America. And for the last 2 years at BTG, they gave me the job of doing the exact opposite. It's to go back to Brazil and tell people that, you know, you have 100% of your investments in Brazil, in local investments, because interest rates are so high. Let me tell you why you should have at least a little bit in offshore. So I have a different hat now. It's almost a 180-degree turn, but I still believe that there's a lot of great things going on in Brazil, obviously as a partner at BTG, dependent on that. But let me give you a little bit of how we're thinking, how I'm thinking about things. I borrowed some of the thoughts from Paulo Vieira da Cunha, who is one of the great economists in New York, who gave a speech at one of our events last week. So I have some written remarks here, but I hope to also be able to get a lot of questions in the Q&A. I think it's always very interesting. But as was mentioned in the previous panel, I think that the craziest thing is that when you look at Brazil in 2024, the economy performed very well. We had strong growth, exports continued to expand, investments were coming into the country despite some of the political questions. Financial markets continued to deepen, so you saw more and more firms borrowing from capital markets and being less dependent on the banking sector. We saw significant growth in fintech. So all the things that you think, oh, this economy is doing well. So when November came along and we started to see a major sell-off in the stock market and in the currency, it caught some people by surprise. I think at the end of the day, when you look at Brazil, it's really all about the fiscal, and the fiscal situation and the trust that you have that the government is going to be doing the right things on the fiscal side and allow the central bank to do what it needs to do to get rates down. It's really what I think has the most impact. Last year, a year ago, the expectation was, maybe a year and a half ago, the expectation was that we're going to finish 2024 with a single-digit interest rate. Some people are even talking about something with a 7 or 8 handle, which for Americans sounds like, okay, the country's going to be in a recession, but for Brazil, it's party time. The economy does very well. The reality was that because of fiscal slippages throughout the year, we saw the central bank actually have to pause the easing cycle that they were going under and actually start to raise rates again. And we saw it last week, another hike of 100 basis points. So today, Brazil's interest rate sits at 13.25. When you talk about inflation-linked bonds in Brazil, they're paying you inflation plus 7+. So my job of trying to sell international funds to Brazilians becomes even harder because people are like, well, I'm making more than 1% in my savings account. Why should I even look at anything else? But the expectation is that because you had this big move in the currency, prices will continue to go up, and with that, the central bank is going to have to continue to increase rates, despite the fact that we already have the highest real interest rate in the world. Right now, consensus is expecting rates to be somewhere in the 15% by the end of the year, and kind of stay there at least for the first half of next year. Obviously, that can't be good for any economy. For those of us who are Brazilians, and we always hear, well, Brazil, we have jabuticabas in Brazil. Jabuticaba is this little black fruit that it only grows in Brazil. And whenever there's something that only makes sense in Brazil, oh, that's a jabuticaba. Well, I'm starting to question whether this tree is starting to run out of fruit. Because, so many of these things go on and on and on. And the result was that the Brazilian stock market was the worst performing market among major markets in the world last year. The currency was definitely the worst among the major economies. As Carla mentioned, almost a 30% decline. When I was at BlackRock, and you look at our peak in assets and investments in Latin America, in Brazil, it was 2011, 2012. Today, that number is significantly lower. The Brazilian stock market in dollars is about 50 to 55% below the peak of 10, 12 years ago. So in this period where the S&P 500 went like this, the Brazilian market in dollars went like that. In reais, it looks okay, but because you had the devaluation. And what's causing all this stress? What's caused this stress not only in the last year, but over the last decade? And again, it goes back to the fiscal situation. Last year, though normally reaching most of its goals, there was a lot of exemptions that allowed the country to reach the primary surplus of close to zero. But because of the heavy cost of debt to GDP continued to expand, getting close to 80%. Unsustainable levels, levels that, and the path, if we don't have any reforms, is going to continue to be going into the 80s and 90s. The administration has proposed some measures, but the market really hasn't bought into it. So Finance Minister Haddad was mentioned in the previous panel as the potential candidate and seen as a saver, as the person that's kind of keeping things under control. But so far, we haven't seen a lot of that have a positive impact on expectations. Inflation this year is going to be somewhere around 5%. The goal of the central bank is 3%, so the path to get to 3% is not exactly clear at this point. And on top of it all, as we mentioned, and it was talked a lot about in the previous panel, next year is an election year. It's a presidential election year, but also Senate, Congress. So it's very tough for you to see any country, but especially Brazil, to go through a reform agenda that's going to get confidence back in a year that's a political year, in a year where people, generally speaking, are spending more and not less. So that's really the problem that we have here. Fiscal responsibility, which was always a term that President Lula knows and dealt with very well, it's not enough anymore to get the market to really accept that things are moving in the right direction. We need fiscal change. We need stuff that my colleague here is going to be talking about later on, which is tax reform. We need the country to become more efficient, attract more investment. It already taxes a lot, but we need to make that more efficient. The way the Constitution in Brazil works today, the rules really bind revenues to spending, and really 95% of spending is untouchable. You can't change that. It's given. So when you have a cap on revenues, and we're going to have lower GDP this year than we had last year, perhaps. I think as Brian mentioned, we've had 3% growth the last 3 years, always beating economists' forecasts. Maybe we'll have another surprise, another jabuticaba. Brazil will be able to grow 2-3% with a real interest rate in the high single digits. Unlikely to happen. There are certain sectors that will continue to do well. Agribusiness in Brazil continues to boom. The oil sector, the energy sector, the mining sector, all very strong sectors that have led growth in Brazil. But is that going to be enough? We'll have to see. I think we need to see really a commitment from administration to make the changes necessary, especially on the tax side, but revisit Social Security reform, look at the way civil services are done, and really the linkage they have in minimum wage and a lot of the payments. These are all the things that, among many, that need to be dealt with. But right now it doesn't feel like anybody really has the political mandate, or at least the political will to do it. So it may become one of those things that we're just going to keep the can down the line until we see things going. Meanwhile, the economy continues to roll along. The political class is really starting to focus more and more on the elections. So I think this debate is going to be one that, unless something happens that forces them to deal with it, it's going to be something that's going to be more of second half of this decade. Brazilian politics, changes happen kind of like, you remember the Hemingway quote, gradually and then suddenly. And I think that's kind of what we're going to have to see here again. I think putting then what's going on outside of Brazil, obviously things don't help either when you're talking about a country that's seen as one of the riskiest assets for investors to look at. Whether Brazil ever becomes the bola da vez, the turn comes for President Trump to focus on it, we'll have to wait and see. But the trade numbers don't really justify that at this point, but there's other things going on there. Obviously the war in Ukraine and the pressure on materials and commodities can also continue to have an impact on that. So I think there's a lot of question marks as to where investors want to look at Brazil. But the fact is it's a 220 million person economy with a middle class that has increased over the last two decades. So there's a lot of consumption to happen there. It's an economy that's very similar to the United States in that exports are not a huge part of GDP. It's more of a service-based economy. So that's something that's interesting. Making the rules, making the changes necessary for Brazil to become a part, which right now it's not a part of this near-shoring, friendly shoring that we see Mexico benefit tremendously, is something that would be very interesting, but we would need the fiscal reform that Mayra's going to talk about. So a lot of question marks. The interesting thing too is like November, December, worst performing market in the world. January, we had a rebound. So the stock market is up almost 12% in dollar terms in the first month of the year, despite the fact that rates continue to go up, despite the fact that you have all these issues. So it is one of these interesting things that keep us employed as Latin American experts or Brazilian experts, but it's one that's not an obvious focus for investors given the complexity of the story and the fact that the U.S. market continues to do very well. But I'll leave it here for now, Carla, and hope and look forward to some of the questions.
Thank you, Will. I really appreciate your overview. It's clear that government spending is something that is hard to tackle. It's been the key problem for Brazil for many years, and it's really, really hard. No administration really wants to take it and start cutting spending in that aspect, so not easy. And what I'd like to share, you mentioned the agribusiness and you mentioned oil and gas. A data point that perhaps many people don't realize is that last year was the first year that in terms of revenue of dollars, Brazil had a greater impact or a greater sales, if you will, of oil and gas, of exports of oil and gas than of soybeans. So that was a real significant shift. Now, there's an explanation for that. The barrels of oil were still very valued. And the harvesting of soybean, as I understand, was lower. So there was less soybean to be exported to begin with. But this year it might be the same, we don't know. But it's becoming an increasingly more important source of revenue for the government. So this is at least something that the government will probably be looking at, and we'll talk more about it in the energy panel, because there are new opportunities, particularly exploration opportunities, that are available in Brazil, and I'm sure the panel will address it. But in talking about all of this, as it relates to taxes, which is probably the other big kind of impact that any investor, as they're looking at building a business in Brazil, needs to sit down and think about. And in fact, on the tax side, there's probably the average company spends a lot of money in terms of staffing up the tax groups and keeping those groups very active and very current on what's going on. Now, Brazil has a myriad of taxes, and so we have a great expert here to talk to us about the tax reform that's going on, Mario, and we'd really like to hear your perspective, particularly kind of the impact on the oil and gas sector because of the comments on the exports and then the importance of the oil and gas sector to Brazil's GDP.
Okay, thank you, Carla, and thank you for having me here. Matos Filho and BRATECC has a strong and very close relationship, and we are very pleased about that. And for me, every time that I'm in Texas, reminds me the high school, Burleson High School, because I graduated in Burleson High School, just south of Fort Worth, and always reminds me, you know, to give it back. When I step in Texas soil, I always reminds me gratitude to give it back everything that you guys and the state of Texas brought me as a person. Yeah? So thank you for having me here. So just because Texas and tax are like complex, you know, I just want to give a very quick introduction, just linked to the previous panel. Brazil, yes, is a jabuticaba. I have in my farm a lots of trees of jabuticaba. Nice. I think we ain't gonna run out of jabuticabas, okay? Just
but
like
it makes wonderful jellies and jams.
Yes, yes, yeah. And whenever you go there, you should try, you know. But what I think is that one of my partners, you know, that now is retired, always said is that the power is just like, you know, it takes place everywhere. What we've been seeing in Brazil, and is linked to the tax reform, is that the fashion in way that the Constitution of Brazil was made was to put more power into Congress. That was designed like that. But since in the beginning of the Constitution, our Constitution is dated back into 1988, this is the newest Constitution that we have, Brazil has changed it couple of times. It's not like you guys that have one and stable. But we have a very good constitution that is being tested, and it's always aligned with more power to Congress. What happened is that the initial presidents, they grabbed the power. So they were like more leading the country. And now what is happening is that the Congress saw the opportunity with weaker presidents to run the country and to put the Constitution in their favor, just like what it is. And so someone may say, oh, Lula passed the tax reform. This is not true in a sense that the tax reform that we are going to talk about is being there for previous mandates. And if you ask any tax specialist, oh, when is going to pass the tax reform? Everybody will say, never. But then when you saw the alignment of these, two guys that was running the Congress, they said, we want to give a legacy. And why is that? Because we have new coming elections, and many people are focusing on who is going to be the president. But what is behind the table is that what is the composition of the new Congress? Because we're going to have a renewal of the Senate. 2/3 of the Senate will be renewed next year. And probably these will set how Brazil is going to perform. And probably the way we see is that we're going to see a very strong victory by the right. So probably we'll see a Congress in Brazil, just like you guys have here, or even more to the right. So giving all that to the table, what the tax reform did is that, first of all, we need to see in these slides how used to be the environment in Brazil. This tax reform that was implemented was the tax reform on the consumption, so VAT. And Brazil VAT, for you guys that are being invested in Brazil, is just a nightmare. Because you have 27 states, 5,500 cities, all with power to enact and impose tax on services on the cities and VAT on the state level. Imagine the complexity of managing all your tax team, tax compliance work, needed to staff all these people to comply with all. And by doing that, the states, they were fighting against each other to attract business. And and how did they do that? I'm going to lower the tax of ICMS. So the state of São Paulo has an 18% tax rate, and then in the south, in the Middle East, they would say, oh, I'll lower and I'll charge you 1%. And so that's the way Brazil was performing business. And specifically for the oil and gas industry, it's always we have tax reliefs on capex investments. So Repetro has been there forever. Pretty much everything that you invest, it's relief for all taxes. And for new energy projects, you have relief on the Haiti. Haiti is a benefit that implies for PIs and COFINS and for ICMS. So always have full exemption also on the investments. You're going to see that the reform preserved all that. This was a big win for the industry, okay? But what happened is that when you see all these pieces of the table, you see the complexity. And how did the reform work? First of all, the main message of the reform is simplification, less compliance work, reduce the monies that you expend on complying. A couple of years ago, probably a decade ago, I was in a tax event, and the Dell guy was explaining how he staffed his team and all that. And then one of the guys that was there that was not investing in Brazil said, hey, it doesn't make any sense, to have a business and to have all this complexity. And then he said, yes, we make money there and things and so forth, but it was too complex. So then what this reform did is that we turned out 5 taxes into 3. So you have now a dual VAT, a federal VAT and a state VAT. This is a huge change. And then you have an excise tax that is linked to ESG agenda, because the tax reform is looking into simplification, is looking into transparency, is looking into environmental and harmful to human aspects. So when you see the dual VAT, you see the simplification. So the PIs and COFINS are now one tax. They will be enforced in 2027. The excise tax on harmful to, and you can see the oil and gas will be subject to the excise tax. will be enforced in 2027, and the unification of the state and municipal, this what we call the VAT, state VAT, a state city VAT, if you can say, the IBS will be enforced in 33. Why? Because you need more time for them to adjust. So you have 8 periods of adjustments. So when you see that, you're gonna see also a new litigation framework. Anybody that invests in Brazil knows that you have this controversy, agenda. So different cities or different states interpret the same law in different ways. Because we have 2 federal laws today that sets balances and set frameworks for how this ICMS is going to work, how the ISS should work. So nobody would be able to go out of these boundaries. But what we've been seeing throughout the decades is that they sometimes step out of the line and so initiate litigations. But imagine if you have one state litigating, then the other state said, he may have reasons, and then out of sudden you have 27 litigations going on in one matter. So what is happening with the tax reform, and this is a huge change, is that you're going to have a committee that is going to centralize all the revenues, and then is going to spread out the monies for the state and for the city and for the federal government. And this is all aligned. There's a very complex, software and agenda in behind of that. But the reform passed because the states and the city and the federal government saw that this will work. And in part, Argentina helped that, because in Argentina they have a system that the federal government collects and then spreads, and they saw it happening. Because, of course, the states and mainly the cities were afraid that, hey, I'm going to have my money grabbed, and the federal government will not pass me the money, and then I'm done. Then they saw that you have this, systems in which the committee collects and is almost like a pass-through, situation. So you're going to have less complexity, less people dedicated to compliance, less litigation, and an ESG agenda. And when you're going to see to the market itself, then we see the balance. You see incentives going more into biofuels, AG, solar energy, powers, and the Haiti in the right of this slide is even better than the old Haiti, because the old Haiti, as I mentioned, covered PIs and COFINS and ICMS, and now the new Haiti covered PIs and COFINS, ICMS, and ISS. There was a huge cost on constructions, because constructions of a solar power, constructions of wind power, it's all about construction, the EPC. So ISS on those services cost a lot, 5%. Now you have a full exemption on that. So you have incentives created by that. And the selective tax, the excise tax, what we call the sin tax, someone says like that. There was a huge victory, because first of all, and we worked closely in the Bar Association to help IBP on this kind of advocacy. That's the kind of work I do a lot in the firm. So we addressed the Congress to have a cap on this excise tax for extraction. This extraction would focus not only in fossil fuels, but minerals, and all that. So the cap set by the Constitution is 1%, and in the legislation that was regulated just 2 weeks ago, we were able to put a 0.25% of tax. That's reasonable, and tends to be, I would say, and I heard from the industry, fair, fair for the new adjustment and new agenda of energy transitions and so forth. That's what I've been hearing from my clients, locally, okay? And so you see a trend to incentivize biofuels, H2, and new projects linked to the, and you see there is a very interesting project that's LNG to power in Brazil. So this matrix, very clean, The other day, one guy went to this first LNG to power project that was designed by Eike Batista, that is in Maranhão. I was walking through and saw the birds, there and things like that. Hey, this is actually clean, and Brazil has a huge potential on that. We've been exploring, for instance, LNG to power projects into the Amazon. Another thing that the tax reform did is that it preserved the free trade zone in Amazon. And this is very important because probably you guys not everyone knows this, but when you go to the main region of the Amazon is the state of Amazonas. The state of Amazonas, I'm a fisherman, so I go there all the time, so I saw it myself. When you go there, 97% of the forest is there, preserved. This 3% represents the city of Manaus and small communities. How do you do that? Because back into the 70s, the federal government said, if we don't incentivize, it's going to happen what happened in the center of the Brazil. They just put heavy machines, chains, and vanish everything. So that's why the reform observed that and preserved and it's amazing because when you fly into the Amazon, it's quite unique. When you start to see the forest, it takes about 40 minutes, only forest you're flying to get into the city, and then you get the perspective. It takes about 4 minutes of flight just to cross the river. It's almost a sea, So it's amazing. So it's a city isolated, and there you have huge industry. Motorcycle industries, television industry, Samsung is there, LG is there, Moto Honda, many industries. So generating a lot of business. So all this was preserved in this agenda. And last but not the least, Brazil is going into direction because we, as a country, want to sit in the table of OECD. And to do that, we need to align. New transfer pricing rules were set last year, radically changing the spectrum of Brazil framework. Now we are fully and 100% aligned with OECD. This will affect oil and gas industry because oil and gas industry were used to the minimum price reference. That was very, I would say, easy because you have a minimum price that is not actual a market value price, and now companies are needing to do adjustments. And now the engineers, the economists of the companies are helping the companies to see what is the market value from the oil companies to the trading related party companies. Of course, the Brazil doesn't want to capture the end price, but at least a fair value price from the oil producers to the trading companies. So this is aligned. Brazil implemented the Pillar 2, the first initiative. It's either do that or die, So companies that make more than 100 million euros that have based in Brazil, have affiliate companies outside of Brazil that are not taxing on a 15% of income tax, then Brazil will capture this revenue. So that's pretty much what Brazil is doing. And a very good thing is that Brazil renewed the treaty with Norwegian. This was approved by the Congress last year. And Brazil made a treaty with UK. This was not in the table, but is being negotiated for years. And to accomplish the 200 years of relationship, bilateral relationship, the Congress approved this treaty. So this is a very good sign. And there is a treaty with US being negotiated that probably during these years won't move that much, but maybe in the future with the renewal of the Congress of Brazil, despite of who is going to win the election, you know, since the Congress that will run the country, hopefully the president will be aligned with the Congress that probably will be very turned to the right. So this is just like an overview of what Brazil is doing so far. Of course, that the main agenda of Brazil, and I would say I was talking with Will, is that it's quite simple. You have your income. You cannot reduce your income if you don't reduce your expenses.
Yeah.
And so the main reform that Brazil needs to do to, you know, let the air flow is to go to the gym and reduce. That's pretty much. We saw this agenda in the previous administration. Unfortunately, due to the COVID, going to the gym was not that easy and not that efficient, let's put it that way. You know, running inside your house was not that, you know, easy. But then we stopped that movement and got to Brazil be big again, but within its side, not let's big man. You got the idea. So the expectation is the next reform is not a fiscal reform, is a government reform, reduction. And the Brazilians know that they need to do that. And the Congress knows that they need to do that. And the new congressmen, they will be there to 2026. So the new Congress that will be passed, probably in their minds, they'll say, hey, the fiscal change was done, and the tax reform was being waiting for like almost 40 to 50 years. So probably that's something that will come. So thank you all for the time. I'll be here for answering questions if needed.
Oh, thank you, Mario. I really appreciate the very clear explanation of the taxes because it's not easy. So basically, it's not a creation of new taxes, but a reformatting of existing taxes and making it the state and municipality and one, the dual tax, which you very clearly pointed out, is one bucket, and then the federal is another bucket. Yeah. And the timing differences is also interesting, the federal side being 2027, with the state and municipalities giving them more time. The key question is going to be who is going to be on this committee to centralize the resources, right? There's going to be a lot of jockeying, I imagine, on a representation there. So given where we are today, I mean, obviously we spoke a little bit more about the oil and gas sector here more specifically, but there are other things that are going on that's still maintaining the big picture. And Will, you mentioned earlier that there are other opportunities in Brazil. Many of the people here in this room understand the oil and gas sector and the petroleum sector, but what are some of the other competitive sectors in Brazil's economy?
Yeah, well, I think the most competitive sector obviously is the agribusiness. I mean, it's an area that Brazil leads in terms of efficiency, in terms of being clean in the way things are produced. So I think a lot of people have the image that, you know, we're going to grow soybean production in Brazil, we're going to be cutting down trees, and that's just not true. It's not what's happening. It's really happening further away from the forest in the center part of Brazil or part of the southern part of Brazil, and I think that's part of the reason why production was down last year, because of the floods that hit Rio Grande do Sul and impacted other areas as well. But that's an area that's been continuing to grow. Brazil feeds the world in many ways, and it's an area that we think will continue to be very strong. Obviously, natural resources are also an area, not just oil and gas, but you know, iron ore is a big one, but you have other minerals as well that Brazil has a lot of capabilities in. I mean, I remember when Petrobras announced the pre-salt in 2007, I believe it was, and how that changed the industry in Brazil. Petrobras is producing 50% more oil today than it was 10, 15 years ago. Unfortunately, the market cap doesn't reflect that, but that's a different story. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. Obviously, the banking sector is very well developed. It's one of the more efficient sectors in the world. One of the biggest fintechs, Nubank, started by Colombia, but in Brazil, and doing very well, and really changing the way people do business there. So there's a lot of different things going on. I think that leave Brazil in the conversation. It is over 200 million people, so it's a large economy, but it's one that needs to take the next step. You know, Brazil has always been the country of the future, but we need, and slowly but surely we're getting rid of the cost of doing business in Brazil that made Brazil so uncompetitive, whether it was Social Security reform, labor reform, and now tax reform being tackled. These are the things that I think will eventually make Brazil more efficient, more competitive, and be able to get involved more, like I mentioned before, in becoming industrialized again. You know, and not because of taxation. You know, there's a huge auto sector in Brazil, but because importing cars has always been so expensive. But let's make it because it is competitive, it is a large economy, and it has the potential to do that. So that's, I think, what we're looking forward to.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate that if you want to submit a question, write it down on a note and raise your hand. Somebody will come by and pick it up as well and bring them over in case of questions there from the audience. One more question for Will, and then I have a question then for Mario while we manage the time here. In our discussions earlier, Will, and it's probably on the minds of many people here, is the impact of AI. What are you seeing in terms of the impact of AI on how business is being conducted in Brazil?
Well, I think any company that doesn't have strategy around AI is behind, right? And I think anybody that's worried about losing their job to AI is looking at it the wrong way. Really, we all should be looking at how is AI going to make us more efficient in the way we do business, whatever business we're in. And those that are more concerned about losing their jobs, well, eventually they will lose their jobs. But I think when we look at Brazil and where we are in that overall discussion, and we think about the $500 billion that have been talked about in terms of the investments in AI here in the United States, the impact that DeepSeek had in terms of how the Chinese may be ahead of the United States, and the fact that NVIDIA that day lost almost one Ibovespa in terms of market cap. You know, NVIDIA was down about $500 billion that Monday. The entire Brazilian stock market is worth about $750 billion. Just think about that. And that's what makes me concerned about, are we going to continue to be relevant in investors' minds, or are we going to become too small and people are just going to say, well, it's a trade at some point, but to try to understand the political the debate that we had before, just maybe it's too complicated and I don't need to be there. And that's what concerns me there. But in Brazil, what we were talking about in the beginning of the year, $100 billion real, so 20 billion investment in railroads. So we're still trying to get the logistics right, and part of the rest of the world is we're far. So I think that's a discussion that we need to have, and that's where we need the new group of politicians that Thiago talked about in the previous panel and Mario talked about here. We need new minds. We need, I think Thiago in a panel last week in New York, it might have been him, it might have been somebody else in the panel, but they talked about how we're going through a transition in Brazil, similar to what Mario's talking about, but from a different way. You know, we went from the military government to a new democracy, and we're learning how this democracy worked, and kind of became divided between the far left and the far right. But most of the people are closer to the center, and that's why they're saying that this group is dominating Congress, and hopefully somebody with a similar mindset could become president. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore because Congress runs things anyway. But having this new generation of politicians, whether it's Tarcísio, whether it's Caiado, whether it's whoever it is, Eduardo Leite, a lot of these new names, and bringing new ideas and giving us a chance to really become part of this new economy and not just try to defend the old economy. I think that's really one of the challenges that we have for the next several years.
Thank you, Will. In fact, you touched on railroads, and that was one of the questions that came up was the impact of infrastructure and how can we measure how the infrastructure in many ways becomes a bottleneck.
Absolutely.
Right, for many of the projects. Can you touch a little bit on infrastructure in a couple sentences?
Yeah, I mean, when we thought, 10 years ago, trucking was 85% of Brazil's logistic network. That's just not scalable, right? I mean, it's not ESG, and it's everything that we don't want. So the investment that we have been making in railroads are super important, and have railroads reaching Mato Grosso do Sul, Goiás, where we're planting all the seeds and getting them to the ports in a much more efficient way. That's huge. That changes the way business is done, reduces the cost of doing business, makes Brazil competitive. But we need to catch up, and then we need to move forward with that. And the privatization of airports. I mean, when my family left Brazil in 1983, we had to go from Congonhas to Rio, and then eventually to New York. Obviously now we have much better airports. When Guarulhos first opened, I remember thinking, oh wow, we finally have an airport that's acceptable, right? And that was the same year that I think I went to the Super Bowl to watch the Giants in Indianapolis, and Indianapolis had more gates than Guarulhos. Indianapolis, not exactly the biggest city in the United States. So, things are evolving, things are improving, but it kind of, in a way, gives us a sense of, well, we are still an emerging. That's why we're still an emerging economy. There's still a lot that needs to be done, and that needs leadership. That needs people thinking forward. And again, not to keep hitting the same point, but that's why hopefully this new group of politicians can really get Brazil into the 21st century.
Yeah.
Thank you. There are a couple questions that came in about biofuels and waste, and those will be topics for the next panel. So I will defer to that. And so I think we're going to end here back with Mario on the tax reform. There's a question here from the audience in terms of the continuity, right? Tax reform is being implemented now. There's going to be a new administration post the elections that you mentioned. Will it continue? I mean, will the reform that happens now, is it going to continue into the future administrations? I know this is a big question.
Yeah.
If you could answer that, you'd be in Las Vegas,
Yeah.
Right.
But you see, what I see is that Brazil is quite stable. So what happened is that this reform was implemented, and Brazil is interesting, this question, because here in the US, the UK, you have an Anglo-Saxon type of interpretation. So you have 5 articles in the Constitution, you have the common sense, and then you live by that. In Brazil, no, we have a Roman tradition. If it's not written there, the interpreter says it's illegal. So by means that all the aspects that I was covering here, they were written in the Constitution. So we have an amendment in the Constitution. And now we have a federal law passed by the 2 chambers. 2/3 of these 2 chambers approved this. So despite the fact that you have a lefty or a right, new administration, this law needs to be complied. Or you need to have a new change, and this is no way to go back. What I see is that Brazil will touch probably some aspects on income tax, not on dividends. We don't see that happen, but probably aiming super rich people try to collect monies from these individuals. We see more and more adjustments to the OECD new panel, but I see stable country as far as taxes, as far as all these, you know, and what I see in the future, as I said, is that this new administration, mainly on the Congress, they will need to be in touch with the people. And when you see the people in the country, they are not divided. You see that in the large centers. But when you go spread out to the countryside, that's the majority of the people that live, they are just in the center. They don't like radicals, either to the left, either to the right. And this means probably mainly because of what was being spoken about the tradition of, you know, Catholic, you know,
Evangelicals.
yeah. When you go to every single city, and this is kind of interesting, that makes, you know, in the mind of the people and makes the connection that the Congress is doing now with the people, because they know that they need to be attached with their people. When you go to any city in Brazil, any city, you see a Catholic church in the center of the city. Go to any city.
Yeah.
And this is amazing.
Mario, but
that's okay.
But we're running out of time.
Yeah, but that's
but
by means that stable, and probably the new administration will need to be in touch with the center, you know, people, and to continue. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I think that this provided a really great opportunity for the next panel. And really the discussion in the next panel, and which Benigna will be leading, is certainly tying into the crossroads that Brazil is at in terms of maintaining the green agenda that we talked about, the Amazon and other aspects, right, that Mario mentioned, but at the same time keeping a focus on the petroleum sector, the oil and gas sector as well. So it'll be a fascinating discussion. In the meantime, we're going to break here for a coffee break and be back at 10:20. But I'd like everyone a round of applause for our panelists here. Thank you.
So I am Benigna Lais, and I am a non-resident fellow here at the Baker Institute. And I'm also, I'm retired from Chevron, so I have a connection with the oil and gas business. And we are very excited in the panel we have today, because we will covering the whole energy matrix for Brazil. Brazil has one of those wonderful opportunities to rely on every source of energy that the country can provide. And it has historically been relying on hydropower and ethanol. And not long ago, as it was mentioned earlier, nobody would have thought that Brazil was going to be exporting oil and gas. And as Carla mentioned in the previous panel, oil and gas has become actually a major contributor now to the revenues of the country. So that has really had a major impact. As I said, we have a panel that will cover the whole energy matrix for Brazil. And we will start with the impact or the evolution of the natural gas and power in Brazil. And this will be done by one of our experts that we have here in the panel, Eric Iberg from S&P, and he is the head of global energy, global natural gas and power, and so he will do an outstanding job, I know, in telling us what Brazil has to offer. Eric, go ahead.
Thank you, Benigna, and bom dia a todos. Before I start, wanted to thank the Baker Institute for the invitation, and also my fellow panelists for sharing this time together and the discussion together. I also wanted to thank BRATECC, and I feel like BRATECC personifies who I am. So for those who know me, I am married to a Brazilian. I lived in Brazil for years. And my wife and pretty much every person in industry that I know thinks that I'm more Brazilian than most Brazilians they know. So happy to be here. And I was just in Brazil last week and making the rounds. Even though I have a global mandate, I still cover Brazil and in charge of leading all of our Brazil gas and power on the consulting side. And what really struck me was that the gas and power markets in Brazil are at a key inflection point. I think it's, as we talked about, Brazil is at a crossroads. So is gas and power. And there was optimism. We've seen a lot of progress, especially over the last 4 or 5 years. But there's a lot of concern around delays. There's a lot of concern around timelines and what does this mean for investment. And we could be talking about a world where the Brazilian gas and power industries are in a modest investment scenario or actually a quite accelerated scenario. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. But I think just starting from the very beginning, as Benigna said, this is a view of the evolution of this sector. And I don't think any of us would say that Brazil is lacking for resource. And that goes across the natural resources space, as we heard earlier today. But in particular, we think about oil and gas, and the pre-salt, of course, dramatically changed the country in general. And now Brazil, of course, Venezuela is the top reserves holder in the region, but Brazil's number 2 in terms of oil. It's 2 or 3 in terms of gas, depending upon how you count Vaca Muerta reserves and resources. And so certainly is a key leader there. When you look at the other side on production, you can see just how much, as we heard a few times, you can put it in numbers. So we've gone from 2.5 million barrels a day equivalent to 4.5. And certainly that has been a bonanza for oil. We are an oil exporting country. And on the gas side, most of the natural gas that we have in Brazil, of course, is associated with that oil production. And I want to point out one key line there, which is the dotted line. That's how much we're selling to the market. The green area is how much we're producing, gross production. And that brings up a big challenge. While we're the number 1 producer in the region for oil, we're the number 5 producer in the region for gas. And it's because of that associated nature of the gas. 1/3 of what we produce today is marketed. 2/3 is used for E&P and also re-injected, or a very small amount that's flared or vented. So, you know, why is it that way? Why haven't we seen that grow, that dotted line grow? Infrastructure, we talked about the importance of infrastructure and logistics for Brazil. It also applies to the gas sector. And certainly market. So is the market going to be there? We have a bit of a chicken and the egg problem in Brazil for the gas market, and that's why we've been pushing reform and opening of the gas market. I think I said it's been going on for 20 years, and Yela Gomez corrected me last year and said, no, Eric, it's been 30 years that we've been doing this, but we have seen significant progress in the last couple of years. And we are seeing a bit of a return to growth. Flipping to the power side, we also have abundant resources in terms of renewables in the Brazilian market. And just to, you know, if you look at that chart on the left-hand side, that is the capacity factor or the average utilization of wind capacity in Brazil. And I can tell you this is unprecedented in the world of onshore wind energy. Brazil is blessed. So 50 to 60% capacity factors for wind. The US, for example, where we've built a lot of wind capacity in West Texas, 20 to 30, maybe 35% capacity factors. So wind has been a big success story. There's tons of resource, especially in the Northeast, but also in the South, and we'll continue to see development. We have a huge history of hydropower. We aren't building a lot more hydropower in Brazil because it's very difficult to do that right now for a number of reasons, but still 70% of our capacity in our system is hydro. And then we've seen a couple of other phenomena over the last 5 years. One is you've seen solar really start to ramp up. That's solar wholesale power. And then we've seen the big change, which is distributed generation. Distributed generation is that light blue color. And so we've effectively built more than 30 gigawatts of distributed generation. That's rooftop solar, but it's behind the meter solar in general. And that's for residential commercial use, but also some industrial use. And that's been policy driven. Effectively, a 2012 policy was passed and allowed for the ability to build behind the meter, guaranteed access to the grid, not pay distribution and transmission fees. So that has led to this happen, but it's also created some challenges. It's created a need for more flexibility. It's challenged wind onshore. We built probably the one place where local content has really worked in renewables has been wind energy. Why? Because the scale makes sense. It's worked for Brazil because of everything we just talked about on the fundamentals. So we've built an onshore wind supply chain that works, but distributed generation on the solar side has pushed that and challenged that a little bit more. So certainly that. And then we heard about interest rates, 13.25, maybe going to 15%. That certainly has challenged this scenario a little bit on the power side. But the resources are there. So infrastructure. What do we need to unlock all these opportunities across the gas and power side? The left-hand side is our planned transmission projects in Brazil. It's unbelievable. But as we all know, in terms of planned timelines and what actually occurs, and this happens all over the world, this is not just Brazil specific, but generally from a planning perspective and country planning perspective, we see that these projects don't materialize in the timelines that we need, and that ends up impacting the ability to ratchet up the solar and wind development onshore, and then potential offshore wind that we've had some recent regulatory movement on. The licensing processes are still challenged. We have had some process improvements over the last couple of years that has helped, but there's still a long way to go. One piece of good news, I think, for Brazil is that we don't see data centers completely revolutionizing the power sector like it is in the US. And with those transmission and distribution challenges, imagine how hard it would be if you were trying to do what we're trying to do here in the US and keep up with data center load and build out the capacity and build out the transmission. As Dan Yergin told me a couple of weeks ago, he reminded me, Eric, there is no transition without transmission. And so certainly that's something that I think is a good thing, that there's not that data centers, we don't see revolutionizing the Brazilian power market. We see it being impactful, and it's certainly going to happen, but not to the levels in some other parts of the world. But we're talking about this, in terms of infrastructure on the power side, just in the next decade, this could be 20, 30, $40 billion of investment. Kind of depends upon where we are in terms of continued reform and regulatory progress. The gas side is very different. The gas side has not had this type of expansion that we've seen on the power transmission side. And part of the reason is, again, so if we look at the last 15 years in the gas system in Brazil, we've had almost no expansion to that system. It's 3 main pipeline systems. What we have done, speaking to LNG to power, is we've built a lot of LNG regas facilities that you can see there in the orange dots. So we now have 8 facilities, and the capacity auction that's upcoming and future auctions, we expect there to be more LNG to power, so more of those facilities. But you start to think about it and you say, wow, this is interesting. We have 8 facilities that are less than 20% utilized in any given year, sometimes less than 10%, sometimes maybe they get to 30% utilized. Is this a good idea in terms of an efficient infrastructure system for natural gas and building and providing access, improving integration, and supporting decarbonization in Brazil? That's a TBD, but there's a very real possibility that, and we had this discussion with a number of folks across the chain, from Petrobras to the transport companies, to the distribution companies, to the power generators last week. And the big question was, how do we create a sustainable Brazil gas market? How do we create a sustainable Brazil gas infrastructure? Do we want to be a system that has 15 or 17 LNG regas facilities just supplying LNG to power plants that are not connected to the grid, not expanding the grid, not supporting the interiorization of natural gas access in Brazil? Or do we want something a bit different? If we got to that situation, we'd have half the capacity of China in terms of import terminals and 1/10 of the demand. So there are still things that need to be really thought through from a planning perspective. But on the gas side, 10, 20, $30 billion also of infrastructure opportunities coming up. And how does all this work itself out? It's back to regulations, it's back to policy. And I heard a couple things today, gradually then suddenly, that Will Anders said, and then simplification from Mario. I think all of those apply for the gas sector. And we've seen the gradual, but then we've seen some sudden progress. And in fact, 2024, I think, was probably a record year for laws that we see. But as we know in Brazil, there's the law that gets passed, which is a really important item. And then there's the regulatory definition and implementation. And the ANP increasingly has a lot more to do. And everyone says, okay, when is this going to make it onto ANP's agenda? So lots of challenges here, but we've had lots of movement. Marina will talk a lot more about the Fuel the Future Law, or Combustível Futuro, that passed obviously on the gas side. The biomethane mandate, some people liked it, some people didn't. It's the 1% mandate. There's been further definition around that. We're seeing the Petrobras auction that'll be coming around biomethane. So there is movement there. And we also saw carbon markets, not going to talk about that. We saw green hydrogen. So we saw a lot of movement and thinking about COP30 leadership, of course, certainly. But the gas and power markets have moved a lot, even with all these challenges. So on the gas side, we have 34 new transport shippers. We have dozens of free customers. One client that I talked to has more than 20 contracts, 46 new import authorizations, thinking about regional integration, 50% increase in LDC gas sales contracts on the power side, which has really advanced in the last decade. 40% of the market is in the free market. There's some challenges to that we'll talk about later. But we've been using, on the power side, we've been using the same legal regulatory framework since the early 2000s. We've been pushing since 2016 a project, and we haven't gotten it through yet. That's really important to get through in terms of market design, price formation, et cetera. There's a lot of challenges. One thing about China, so Brazil is the #2 importer of solar panels in the world, behind the EU, from China in terms of solar panels. So again, dependence on supply chain, the permitting issues that we've mentioned, the capacity auction, leilão de capacidade, which is going to come later in the second half this year, really important for Brazil in terms of providing flexibility. There's also gas storage that's starting to move, the niche projects on small-scale LNG to power that were referenced earlier, and CNG and biomethane solutions to try and get access to gas into other parts of the country. So lots on the agenda, and certainly looking forward to what happens, but a lot will depend upon how this plays out. So a quick introduction to the history and then ultimately where we are today and the challenges, but the big opportunities.
Thank you so much, Eric, for that great introduction to this panel, which I'm very grateful that you gave us this whole overview about the development and evolution of the natural gas and power in Brazil. Now we will get to this other topic, which is also very, very exciting. It is the renewables. And here we have an expert from Rystad, Marina Dominguez, who will tell us what is happening and how ethanol actually build the beginnings of this renewable business, I would say, with the infrastructure required to continue developing renewables in Brazil. Marina, it's all yours.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for being here this morning. So huge thank you to the Baker Institute and also the BRATECC initiative. So I have a lot of molecules to cover in a very short time, so hopefully this is going to be a productive session. But I think maybe the overall discussion is that all of those new molecules, or all clean molecules, will play a major role, and they have been playing a major role in Brazil, especially with the ethanol and the biodiesel markets in the country. But what you guys see as not as the dark gray colors, but the new colors, then we're identifying new potential molecules that are going to be crucial and already playing about 15 to 20% role in Brazil fuel market. So we're talking about sustainable aviation fuel, we're talking about renewable diesel, which is made with different feedstock that is not first generation. So we're talking about waste and everything that is not related to an immediate crop growth feedstock. Then also ammonia and methanol, which are both derivatives of hydrogen. So these are the new energies that we're seeing in Brazil. Several companies investing in those molecules, not only in Brazil, but that tends to be a global market, different than the power story that tends to be more anchor in a country, as we can ship electrons overseas, but those molecules are something that is something that will grow, and that's where we expect Brazil to play a major role. So we wouldn't be discussing any of those molecules if it wouldn't be the policy background. So it started in the 1970s, the whole ethanol story in Brazil, and then we increasingly changed the views in several things. And one of the laws that was already alluded to in this event here a couple times is the fuels of the future. So it does create significant impact, and what we're forecasting for 2030, kind of like a whole new molecules or clean molecule mix. So in terms of like the split between the traditional sugarcane ethanol versus the next ethanol made with corn, so we do expect this together with biodiesel, so the most traditional biofuel molecules to continue to be the majority, but then it does open a lot of space for two other ones, which is the sustainable aviation fuel, which is directly alluded to in the bill, and also the renewable diesel, so everything that is made with second generation feedstock. And that's reflecting on new blend mandates that are going to be kind of like the next steps to increase that entire molecule and the differences in the Brazilian market. So historically, we already had kind of like a path in Brazil that already allowed mandates and allowed for that growth. But then after 2020, in terms of like after 2025 and getting already in the next projections, then about 25% could be a possibility of mandates for blending. And then when we talk about the renewable diesel, so the second generation feedstock that comes mainly from waste, then we're talking about up to 3% of that entire market. So these are policies that we're going to see significant impact, and they are related to a lot of other aspects as much as it goes for the oil demand and oil production forecasts. In terms of the whole feedstock availability and the soybean discussion has been already discussed here. So the biofuel does have a limitation in terms of what is available in terms of feedstock, and we're talking about bioorganic matter. So in Brazil, it's very tied to what is the next, not only sugarcane, but then the next one is going to be the soybean. So we don't foresee, for now, at least in the near future, any kind of like cap for what has been the next mandate. So still a strong possibility in growth, but then if we start tapping into more international markets, especially the sustainable aviation fuel, then we're going to start seeing more and more restrictions from the feedstock side of things. But then another aspect that the law has touched upon is the hydrogen piece. So it does talk about hydrogen, and there was a presentation here earlier today that did mention the combination of the biofuel industry and also the hydrogen industry, and partially because, for example, to produce sustainable aviation fuel, you will need some sort of hydrogenation part in the process, so it does require hydrogen. So how does that hydrogen account for several discussions, and one of this is the carbon intensity of that hydrogen, and that has been a major point of discussion globally. So how do you account for the carbon intensity of a kilogram of hydrogen? And several countries had come up with their own definition and their own carbon intensity. So Brazil is the highest one. There's only one more definition that goes above the 7 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen in Brazil, which is the Chinese definition from hydrogen produced from coal. So that goes beyond the 15 kilograms. But then everything else, including the clean or the renewable hydrogen definition in China, goes below that 7 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. So that was kind of like creating some impacts in terms of like how will Brazil manage to export that hydrogen, especially if EU requirements, for example, is below the 4 kilograms per kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. So the harmonization of that entire market, and how do you account apples to apples? So is Brazil accounting the same way as Europe, and how is it so? So for example, European, the renewable fuels of non-biological origin, the RFBO definition does require that hydrogen comes from electrolysis. Brazil tends to be more of a biofuel kind of story, so biomass will play a role. So that includes renewable feedstocks such as the biomethane stored in the country. So with that, there is some sort of limitation in terms of how we're seeing that whole market progress. Brazil might be a major consumer of hydrogen itself, especially if it does tie that entire ESG discussion to the laws, like the fuels of the future. Thus, so you will require that clean molecule to also decarbonize strategic segments. So as you can see, a major one of that is the entire iron and steel industry. So if we do have that kind of like target, even to comply with the Paris Agreement, which Rystad Energy doesn't see as the most likely scenario. So still a very strong one, which is the 1.9 increase, degrees Celsius increase in global temperature. We do foresee a lot of need for hydrogen in the steel and also iron reduction industry. Another one is the road transport itself, so it competes with the ethanol segment. So fuel cell vehicles, which are as well like electric vehicles like battery, will require the buildup of a new infrastructure in the country, which we do see a strong limitation. So a lot of potential for Brazil to meet and have that need, especially on the fertilizer side of things, but a lot of issues in terms of how to achieve, especially because most of the hydrogen projects in Brazil are actually targeting export. So about 85% of those are projects to go overseas. So that includes not only hydrogen, but also entire fertilizer story. Most of the projects in Brazil are at the coast, so it does facilitate the transportation, and also at the northeast part of the region, which is the shortest distance as possible, especially to European markets. And then if we think about the economics of this, and since, so from all the projects that have been announced so far, a lot of the orange bars here in the chart represent northeast states. So that also ties back to the political discussions that we were having before. So the hydrogen economy benefits mostly those northeast states in the country. And then the split between domestic and exports also kind of like being critical for decision making. So is it the credit, for example, that has been discussed in the Hydro, which is the law that passed for hydrogen, which has ties back to the Hydro discussion that was alluded to here before. It does have some complications in terms of like the tax. So the Hydro has explicit inclusion of the PIS/COFINS, but then in the new tax reform, we do see the combination of those two. So how the new Hydro will be formalized to accommodate for changes in the tax reform, it's still a topic of discussion in the country. But we do see, in any case, a lot of that incentive actually going to export markets, very similar to the hydrogen development here in the US and the Gulf Coast. Another topic, and two more interesting topics that the fuels of the future really brings to the country's entire carbon capture. So it does enable, so as was brought here earlier today, in Brazil, if it's not written in the law, is illegal. So now there is a carbon market. That was, I think, section 6 or 7 of the Fuels of the Future alludes to the creation of a carbon market. So how is that carbon market going to function? Still a lot of uncertainties, but Brazil does have that the large split of the orange piece in that bar chart, which represents South America. So carbon capture is a story that is a growing story in the country, not as much as here in the US, just because natural gas prices are so much more expensive, but it does have a role to play. And then if we think about the different industries that can look at a capture rate, so we're talking about cement, we're talking about iron, steel, and hydrogen. So those are the three most expensive industries for CCUS and carbon and the transportation costs, but then followed by gas power, waste, chemicals, and other segments that are coming at a lower hanging fruit. We do recognize that there is kind of like a carbon tax required, and that carbon tax in Brazil tends to be slightly higher, so above the $125 per ton of CO2 capture, which is very far away from what is currently in the pipeline for the country. And that's just because in terms of emission points, Brazil has a lot of them that is concentrated in the iron and steel or other industries like the cement, so they tend to be a little bit more expensive. Then what was in the Fuels of the Future law, and how is the definition of the Brazilian greenhouse gas trading system? That's still a big discussion. We do expect advances in this before COP30, so that's a very big conversation in Brazil right now. How will that combination between the voluntary and mandatory carbon markets will actually occur? So that's a key topic, not only for the energy, but also tends to be a lot of discussions of nature-based credits as well. And if we look at how the voluntary market has been involved so far, there is issues in terms of the integrity of those markets. So we did see 2024 more credits being retired. And if we look at the high integrity rate, it does have more retirements than what it was considered by RISET as a high integrity market. And then just to finalize this discussion in terms of the voluntary carbon markets, there is probably now a competition or companies making their allocation decisions in terms of if it's going to be technology-based or nature-based carbon markets. So the nature-based discussion goes very centered to what we expect to be a central topic in COP30, which is the Amazon forest and how that will play a role in the Brazilian development in terms of the sustainable goals, and then everything that is related to the technology-based credits, also receiving a slight push with the Fuels of the Future. So now we do see the possibility of industry to be accommodated in that segment rather than just the nature-based discussion. So I hope Rachel will talk about the whole sustainability a little bit broader so we can have discussions around this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. That was very, very good. And we have discovered that the energy sector never stops surprising us with new developments, considering that hydrogen was something that has been talked about for a long, long time, and here it is coming back, and now apparently making inroads.
Let's hope so. It's
yes.
still far, but
yes,
let's hope so.
but it's very interesting. And now we will be talking about Brazil and sustainability, and my colleague here from the Baker Institute, Rachel Medlock, who is the Deputy Director of the Center for Energy Studies, will be covering that topic, which you may have been hearing about sustainability for a long time, and is often approached through narrow lenses, whether it is carbon reduction, ESG compliance, or circular economy principles. Given the complexities of global supply chains that we have been talking about in this summit so far, sustainability, economic realities, and geopolitical constraints, how do you define sustainability in a way that both is holistic and actionable for businesses and policymakers worldwide, and particularly in Brazil?
Well, thank you, Benigna, and thank you all for joining us today. And my angle that I come from is a little bit different than the rest of my colleagues here on the stage, in that I'm very much energy agnostic, the way that I approach things and the way that I look at things, and the lens that I look at when it comes to sustainability is very broad. And I think some of that is due to my background and my interest, certainly. I spent a lot of time looking at things from a systems level, very much like sustainability is about a systems balance. So I've looked at things from a global level, from a population level, community level, all the way down to the biological systems and chemical systems and the molecular level and the atomic level. And so I'm a former chemist and physicist and biologist, and so all of those things play well into how we understand sustainability and how we talk about sustainability. But in the world of energy, and not just energy, but in other disciplines, when we talk about sustainability, like Benigna opened with, it is coming from a very narrow lens. And so if we were to poll perhaps this room, I think a lot of us would walk away with saying that sustainability is more of an environmental focus. And certainly that's where much of the market is focused when we look at investments, when we look at discussions around boardrooms. It's very much about carbon reduction and emissions and climate change. And those things confine sustainability into these little silos. And it distorts markets, it distorts investments, distorts our understanding about how we get to systems balance. And so sustainability really is about the intersection of the three fundamental pillars of sustainability. And so that's understanding society and societal interactions, implications. It's looking at the environment, all aspects of the environment, not just climate and emissions, but things like biodiversity. And it's also looking at the economy, so the financial and the commercial pillar of sustainability. And so if you think about sustainability and the intersection of those pillars, it is buttressed very much by market design and strong and practical policies and innovation. And all of those buttress the three pillars of sustainability that support the Sustainable Development Platform. And so if you have an overemphasis on any one of these pillars, say the environmental pillar, which much of the focus is today, then you risk destabilizing our quest for sustainability. And we can't get there. It destabilizes the entire system. So it's really important to understand just the balance that is needed and the understanding and awareness that's needed to get to systems level sustainability. And certainly that is not easy to do because sustainability is very much dynamic. And perspective matters. Sustainability, the way we see it here in the United States, the way that it might be perceived in the EU is very different than what's happening in other parts of the world, especially developing economies, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and it really depends on the seat that you sit in. And when we talk about energy transitions, it's multiple transitions. There's not one pathway, there's multiple pathways, and each one of those come with enormous trade-offs. And that really is what sustainability is about. It's about understanding trade-offs. How do you get there? How do you manage the risks? How do you quantify those risks? How do you understand rebound effects and risk shifting? And to look at sustainability, and I know you can't see this slide here, and it's not really meant for you to read this, but it's to show the complexity of the system. And certainly this is not an exhaustive list under each one of these domains. It's to show that intersection and to show that there are enormous trade-offs with sustainability and the dynamic nature of it. And the way we talk about sustainability generally is that it's a property of something. We talk about sustainable biofuels, sustainable bioplastics, and sustainable electric vehicles, but that is erroneous. Things in isolation cannot be sustainable. It's about understanding the entire system. And we do this from a life cycle perspective. We do this from all of the operations and activities from cradle to grave. So from resource extraction to processing to production and manufacturing of those products, to the use of them, all the way to the end of life. And so that's why it's so complicated. the way that I think the general public and media understands it is through that narrow lens. But in order to understand how we need to get to something actionable with sustainability, we first have to understand that it must be a systems level approach. We have to understand especially the socio-environment and socioeconomic dimensions of that, because what is oftentimes overlooked is the human dimension and the social dimension of sustainability. And with Brazil's sustainability ambitions, it has to be human-centric. And that is because of the large informal sector that is a part of Brazil and Brazil's economy. And so 40% of Brazil's total employment is from the informal economy, and that's the shadow economy that's not represented, that is they don't operate under health and safety regimes or and don't have that social representation. And if you look at and so think about sustainability again from that systems level, cradle to grave, from life cycle, from the beginning to the end of life. Well, the informal sector is responsible for an enormous amount of recycled material in Brazil. And I think I have a figure here. I think they collected over 90% of recycled materials in Brazil, and that's all recycled materials. And PET, for instance, polyethylene terephthalate, which is a type of plastic, you see it in plastic bottles, they are responsible for recycling over 55% of PET in Brazil. Our recycling rate here in the United States is half that, around 23-24%. And so when we talk about sustainable systems and looking at things sustainability from that broad lens, we can't do that without that human societal dimension and understanding how what are those trade-offs to those parts of society where if we remove that, or if we created more waste through sustainable, what we're calling sustainable solutions, what does that mean for those segments of society that operate and help us get to those circular economy goals? And so again, it's really very much multidimensional. It crosses over a lot of different disciplines. It requires unprecedented collaboration between different industries and different sectors to get to where we need to be to understand the systems level impacts of sustainability. And so this is something that I show from time to time, and it's about the blind spot of sustainability. And that is the carbon tunnel vision that we have. When we talk about sustainability, with all of the focus on emissions and climate change, and as you can see, like in that last slide that I highlighted, climate change and emissions are just two of the very small segments of the overall picture of sustainability. But when we have that tendency to have the carbon tunnel vision, we lose sight of all of the other different important aspects under the large umbrella of sustainability. And this causes societies and governments and industries become maladapted, where we lose that resilience. We lose societal resilience and ecosystem resilience. And so it's hard for us to focus on the overall system when we operate under the so-called carbon tunnel vision. And so I think the most important point here to understand of sustainability is, the message is very simple, is that sustainability is complicated. And to get there and to make it actionable, you have to have that systems level understanding of what sustainability is. And so we can go into further discussion on that with some of the questions that we have as we move forward.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for that very thorough presentation on how to look at sustainability in a holistic manner. So I know that is a challenge. So now we will have the industry perspective given by Rachel. That's the way you want to be called. So he is the CEO of Petrobras Americas, and we know what a great job Petrobras has done. So we're looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Benigna, and thank you, Baker Institute, for inviting me to join you today here as BRATECC for the invitation. And at the end of the day, we saw from now that we have a country that has a huge potential in almost every kind of sources. We saw from Rachel that the sustainability issue is not a simple thing. We have to see all the dimensions. But at the end of the day, as an industry, we have some shareholders waiting for us to see what we're going to do for the next 5 years. Probably most of you or some of you are waiting for that information, and we have to decide. We have to prioritize what we're going to invest in the future. So after the disclaimer, we here have to decide. We are in Brazil, a lot of opportunities in every kind of investments, but we are oil industry. We have a lot of reserves, as Eric showed us. We have a lot of potential for oil and gas also, not only for renewables. And when we see in Brazil here, we already have a starting point that is completely different from most of the countries. And even we have this agenda to be the carbonization process to begin, we still have here a lot of demands for fossil fuels. And Petrobras recognized that. We need to keep investing to supply this energy, as well as to keep investing in innovation to make us able to invest on other kind of sources according to the society needs. And we need to decide, and for the last business plan, we decide that we are going to maintain our relevance in Brazil energy supply. This is the base of our investments for the future. And when you saw here in the left side of the slide, we supply 31% of the energy of Brazil today. This is the share of Petrobras as a whole. And we forecast that we are going to increase 57% from 2022 to 2015. And we're going to maintain the share. This is the base of our investment plan. And some of these investments will, of course, goes on being in oil and gas, but also in different sources of energy. As we know here, as you can see, we are now seeing that the share of the energy that Petrobras is going to invest, between 8 and 11% will be from renewables. In numbers, we are going to invest for the next 5 years, we are going to invest $111 billion all as a whole. And you can see here that most of them are still in oil and gas. It could not be different, because we believe that we cannot do this investment in renewable in a rush. We have to be very careful, because if you go in a rush, we probably will not be organized, not even just, because the cost for the end of the customer will increase. So we keep investing in oil and gas as a way to finance the future. And as you can see here, we are going to invest in RTC, that is the refinery, transportation, and commercialization, business as usual, but we increase the amount of money dedicated to the new sources of energy. And this, behind the scenes here, is a perception that we have to keep investing in what we do better. Because if you see in the previous years of oil industry as a whole, oil industry invested in kerosene to substitute oil from whale. But to be there, oil company invest a lot in drilling and lamp design. And when the electricity threatened the kerosene, the oil companies should have to reinvest in a different source of demand, and we produce gasoline for internal engine. So this climate change call is not the first time that the oil industry is being challenging to reinvent itself. But the only thing that we can, as a common thing on this process of innovation, is the molecule side of the equation. Because when you see, okay, what you can do and the benefit of renewables, oh yeah, the most obvious alternative right now is wind and solar. But to be frank, if we keep investing in wind and solar, we cannot generate the above average returns as the oil. Because we have a capability and skills to invest and to take risk. But those alternatives, of course, we are going to invest on these alternatives for our refineries, for our process, but we cannot afford any kind of new skills from that path. This is a kind of investment on a regulation that is regulated, and the price is regulated also. But there are a lot of sources of energy, as we discussed previously, that's still in a different path that can be invested right now and should need another kind of investments to be ready to be economic. And oil industry is willing to take this risk because we see what we're doing. We invest several million of dollars to go to the off-sea, to the off-site, to invest millions of dollars in a road that can be empty. We take risk. We know how to do it. We know how to deal with downside risk. We know how to expose us in upside risk. So probably I will invest a lot in source of energy that probably will have to bear more risk than the ones that are ready for that. So in all those investments, we are going to bring back the DNA of oil companies. We are going to keep investing in biofuels. In a lot of, here is just the investment that we are going to do in upstream. But here is all the investments that we are going to do on the first few years on biofuels, on low carbon energy, on innovation, and so on. So we are going to invest a lot in decarbonization for the scope 1 and 2, but we also will look for the new sources of energy too. How to make those new sources, or the sources that are here but are not economic yet, able to be in a larger scale. That's what you're going to do in the future. And I'm willing here to any question, and I hope that is
We have plenty
you.
of questions, Rachel. We have plenty of questions. But before we get to the questions from the audience, I want to ask all of you to give us a view about the legal and regulatory framework currently in place is really up to the challenge of covering all this and the energy matrix, since you have been very thorough in telling us about the many opportunities that Brazil offers for different sources of energy. So maybe if you can start telling us, Eric, from your perspective, sure, if the current framework meets the needs of the market and the requirements of the market and the requirements of the country as well.
Sure, and I'll focus on gas and power.
Yeah.
I think as you heard, the answer is clearly no. It's less about having the law and the initial framework, it's more about the regulatory definition and implementation. And just to take a couple things on the power side, right now what we're really worried about, one is we have effectively power procurement that's done, that's technology specific. It's not technology agnostic. We think we need to move at S&P Global more toward a technology agnostic situation. Two is we have curtailment issues where you're seeing renewables getting increasingly curtailed. Chile has up to 30% curtailment, which basically kills all the financials and economics for some projects and companies. We're not there yet. We're talking about 5, maybe 10% curtailment right now, but we're headed that direction. So we're nervous about that, and we need to deal with curtailment. And I think the other one is cost asymmetries. And so in the free market, which is 40% of power, we see a huge differential between what can be procured in the free market versus the regulated market. And of course, if you're a free market consumer, you also are able to pay 50% transmission fees, and then that's socialized across the regulated market. And so that growing gap is a big concern. for us. And then subsidies phase out. We've been trying to do subsidies phase out because we have fantastic conditions, and I think there's a view that we don't need the level of subsidies that we have in Brazil today to support renewables build out. We think it happens regardless, but it has had some challenges getting through and getting fully defined and pushed out. That's the power side. On the gas side, we have a lot longer way to go. In terms of the free market, it's still minuscule compared to what it is in the power market. We actually have a lot of lessons to learn from the power market, and things such as we have clearinghouse that works in the power markets and the free markets. We have an ISO system operator, so a centralized operator for the transport system. Increasing market liquidity has been really important, and data availability. How do you do that? It's a very dangerous topic, but gas release. And gas release has been done all over the world, but it's been done very, very badly. It's been done badly and rarely well. And so if you're going to do a gas release program, you have to be extremely thoughtful about the sequencing of that and how it will actually work, and make sure that it doesn't impact the market and have very negative effects, as it has in many cases. And so there's a lot of things to resolve on both sides, and certainly it's good to see the capacity auction. It's great to see the battery auction coming on the power side. It's good to see the free market starting to open up on the gas side, but we have a lot of way to go.
Thank you. A big opportunity there.
Yes.
What about your side, Marina?
I think in general, I think Brazil is generally more aligned in terms of like what is the plan. So I think we maybe the last 2 years there has been a lot of uncertainty, but now it's kind of like clear that there is a strong focus for sustainability in the country. There is a strong focus on different aspects of what kind of energies, like prioritizing what Brazil's already good at, and then like moving from there and expanding this to the gas regulation, which came very late. So expanding all of that. I think one key challenge is that Brazil is adopting this sustainability focus on for the energy segment, while we see the world changing its priority to energy being reliable and affordable. The data center discussion brings that immediately to the discussion. It's a base load that has to be supplied 24/7. And we're bringing renewables, and we're bringing all of that to the equation in a critical moment where the world is pausing on sustainability for several reasons. So we had the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We have the US also shifting its priorities now, like needs for data center and how we're meeting that power. We're not in a post-COVID moment anymore where we saw that spike for renewables. We passed that, so Brazil shifted the policy, and it's clear the direction, but it's unclear how it will unfold in a new kind of world in that situation. So on the clean molecule side, I think the country made significant advances in terms of like the new legal framework. It did also, the new structure of the tax reform, I think it does benefit a lot of the technologies in the energy segment. It facilitates, as was already mentioned here before today, a lot of the complexity that was around the taxation for some of the key technologies. I think, as Eric just mentioned, I think the economics of solar, especially solar, is already in place. We saw huge declines in solar modules. So that doesn't really sustain the subsidy argument for very long. But then what is interesting, or what will be the next pieces to see in Brazil at least, is how is that whole sustainability story, is it going to be sticky enough to sustain the whole needs for the needs of investment that we kind of like want for the oil and gas segment, especially for the gas segment in Brazil, and then what kind of like, how is it unfolding for the whole industry segment. So we saw a lot of industry activity decline in Brazil in the past years, and a big part of the discussion is the energy security or reliability in the country. Yeah. So and that has been a lot of discussions in terms of like how the ONS, so the operator, national operator system in Brazil for grid transmissions, for all of that, accommodates for the increasing renewable power. And also the whole gas story that is expected to grow, but maybe not enough legal framework there to accommodate for this. So many changes already happened. We now know what is the general framework to follow, which brings more certainty to the market for sure. So now we can see investments and we can see kind of like where the government expects and which segments will be highly incentivized in the country. So the biofuel story is remaining strong or getting even stronger. The whole molecule side, so hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel, carbon capture, this starts to make more sense than it used to be 2 years ago, but maybe the momentum, the global momentum, is what's going to be the next caveat to that whole framework that was built in the last years.
Well, that's certainly critical considering that the goals for the energy is expected to be reliable and also affordable.
Exactly.
So those two expectations require significant amount of work to meet them. Yes.
I think Petrobras knows this very well.
Yeah. So, Rachel, what do you think about the regulatory and legal framework that Brazil currently has? And
well, I think there certainly is a lot of momentum around sustainability. Again, it goes back down to how is it defined and that. But there's a lot of interest from the government and from all of society on advancing sustainability, and you can see that in some of the frameworks that they have now on the first ever circular economy framework that the Brazilian government put out. And so that institutionalizes and creates regulations and a framework for advancing the circular economy, and it's very broad and it covers all energy sources, and it's about creating regenerative systems and societies and education, and so that will help spur some of the actions towards the higher level sustainability related goals. Now certainly from my point of view, from this higher level thinking that I have on sustainability, there's certainly gaps, and how do you bridge those gaps? I mean, for instance, there's the National Biofuels Policy, and that has a focus on carbon intensity. And so back to my earlier points, just focusing on carbon intensity when looking at biofuels, you're never going to get to sustainability because you may not be taking into account impacts to land use changes, and things like water intensity, waste, and waste management, and so things like that in isolation may not get you to that point, but there certainly is a lot of momentum around sustainability in general in current frameworks. Thank you.
And surprise, Rachel, most of these questions are for you. So I guess your perspective in terms of where Petrobras is going and how does it deal with the current regulatory framework and with the legal framework, what you are allowed to do and what you want to do as a company, and in partnership with private companies from around the world that I know you have partnerships. So what is your view from that perspective in terms of what the legal framework and the regulatory framework allows you to do and doesn't allow you to do?
Okay, with this pace of changing in the world, the regulation will always need some changes, and there are some gaps. There is no possible way to have the best regulation for all with this kind of thing. Look at that. 2 weeks ago, we were looking to the NVIDIA as a star. Then we're going to make all the chips, and we're going to have like a demand for electricity concentrated in few countries. But I don't know, deep sea can change that. We can now have a lower demand for energy and a different geography. I don't know. Everything is changing so fast. So regulation is always need to be changing. So this is the first reflection. The second one is that happiness is relative. In terms of Brazil, when you are going to invest in Brazil, you're going to compare the alternatives that you have against Brazil. And the regulation is just one cost of everything. So if we have like a lot of opportunities around the world against Brazil, And Brazil has a much better position in terms of renewables. You're going to compare the difference in regulation and you're going to invest there if the investment is good enough to pay this cost. So to my point of view, I believe the facts as the investments are increasing. I agree that the regulation should be, of course, changing according to the changing of the environment. But we saw some graphs suggesting that investments were there. So this probably might have an answer to your question.
Can I make one additional point to that? And so I guess this highlights for me just the political construct and the commodification of sustainability and what it's become. And when that, sometimes when that's embedded into legal frameworks and regulations, it can lock that into place and create a stagnant environment for innovation and development. And so I oftentimes might see that as a challenge when sustainability becomes more of a political construct than what it's meant to be. And also that challenges us from looking at sustainability and investing in sustainability across life cycles, because we don't have. We have an imbalance of regulations and policies and investments across an entire life cycle. We focus on certain segments without really thinking about, okay, well, what happens to this at the end of life? Or what happens to this upstream? Or what happens to this when we have to ship this to China for processing? Mm-hmm. And all of those environment, health, and safety implications and transportation costs and transportation emissions and so forth. And so regulation has a tendency to narrow things and keep things pretty confined, which is a bit of a risk when it comes to sustainability.
And I think you said, Rachel, earlier that having an agnostic view of that is really, really important. Mm-hmm. And that applies to all of our different commodity segments as well, in its own way, as I mentioned on the power side. But certainly when you're thinking about sustainability, there's so many different elements of it that you have to take into account. And then the life cycle across the complete value chains that, as you said, regulation tends to try and help in specific points and may end up being actually create more challenges. Obviously, yeah. the intention is good.
Right. It has a tendency to lag, but yeah, that is true.
And the next issue, since we are at the university having this conversation, we have to really think about how technology and innovation are playing a key role in this business. So let's start with you, Eric, and see how do you see innovation and technology having a role in what you are doing?
Sure. I mean, I think if we look at the gas and power industries, certainly we've seen it, as Marina mentioned, that the cost of solar has come down tremendously. That was a big bet that parts of the world made a conscious decision to provide policy support and regulatory support for solar and wind and batteries to accelerate the learning curve, reduce costs, and it's worked generally. And I think that that's being applied to hydrogen, CCS, other technologies, small modular nuclear, lots of things that I don't think we know today how big it can get. Yeah. We have huge ranges of market sizes depending upon how that learning curve is accelerated on the cost front and on the technology front. So I think all of us are watching that. It's a big bet to try and figure out which technologies win out.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that the technology conversation brings a lot here, as Rochelle mentioned previously, and I think several layers to it. Maybe the main topic nowadays is the data centers, and regardless where it's going to be based, it's just a huge power load that it's going to need. And the US is the leading country for data center sites, so we estimate above 100 gigawatt capacity already projected for after 2030 in the US, and it requires that baseload energy. So to what extent US LNG will compete with domestic power needs in data centers in the country might change the dynamics of the whole gas market internationally and open new opportunities for new players, since that power in the US might need to be concentrated to supply domestic needs. So will Permian or will the current basins in the US be enough to supply power demand for data centers? Will that continue to grow? And to what extent are US citizens willing to pay the same premium as LNG importers such as Germany? We saw after Russia-Ukraine conflict that price spiking, and that's basically the result of LNG market trade. So will that rationale be applied here, and that what is left for Brazil to enter this new gas and competition in a new geopolitical world, but also with new US needs? So I think that kind of story, it's going to be unfolding in the next, not very far, but like before 2030, that equation of the story needs to be talked about, and also the entire renewable deployment, which is much faster than a thermal natural gas generation plant. So how will that whole story be affecting the Brazil story? I think it's very interesting. And just to mention that major equations when we're talking strictly about carbon emissions. So having those two segments already very solid and consolidated in the country kind of brings a different risk assessment, and how Brazil sees as the new energies as more strategic than, for example, other countries that have their core energy mix based on fossil fuels. So I think that can be also something that will result for technology advancements, not necessarily developed in the country, but to see Brazil as this promising land where technology can just be deployed quickly.
Yeah.
And I like the data centers point in the US because it does have implications for Brazil. When I was there last week, I heard a lot about equipment backlogs. Why? Because the US power needs are growing so fast. You know, I talked to a data center CEO and he said, we can't deploy renewables fast enough. We can't build the transmission. No transition without transmission. We can't build the distribution, and we can't build pipelines either. So natural gas is tough, and the timelines as you talked about. But certainly everyone's doing what they can. They're doing behind the meter, they're doing on site, and we hear nuclear. And so there's a lot of things happening, but what does that mean for Brazil? I heard someone say there's a 6-year backlog to get a gas turbine. Well, right now we're about to go to the leilão de capacidade. Well, what do you think is going to win quite a bit in that? It's natural gas. And so how is that going to work? How is Brazil going to get the equipment? How does that supply chain get impacted because of the data center story? Which isn't just the US, it's other places in the world too, of course, but it certainly impacts when you start thinking about supply chain.
Yes, absolutely. We see similar 6-year backlog for turbines.
6 years. Wow. So from your perspective, Rachel, how do you see the technology and innovation?
Well, I mean, I'm always a proponent of innovation and technology, and the context that I look at it within this conversation is where is it most needed from across the life cycle to do the things that you want to do in the most, whatever it's, sustainable manner possible. And is that end of life, more end of life operations? Is that integrating circular solutions where you embed waste as a resource? I mean, Brazil has enormous amount of organic waste that could be, and so there's a lot of opportunities there for circular operations and integrating that. But there's a significant waste crisis in Brazil and really around the world, but Brazil especially being one of the top waste producers in the world and the fourth in plastics. And so how can you create a circular carbon economy? And how can you just work within your existing footprint, leverage the physical and natural capital that you have now and work within the existing footprint, and instead of, because everything we do, every technology, every innovation, just existing, you're creating impacts and emissions. And so how can we work within our existing footprint and do that and innovate in that space? I just think that there's this entire war on carbon that doesn't make sense to me from a systems level perspective. From an ecosystem perspective, because the amount of carbon never changes in our ecosystem. It just shifts reservoirs. whether that's the atmosphere or different biomes, microbes, and so how can you tap into those different processes, biodegradation and respiration and all of that to create a circular carbon economy and use things like durable plastics and to create a more regenerative system with that, investing in recycling and reuse operations or looking at living carbon, like biochar and things like that to help enhance soils for food production. And so for me, innovation is not about creating more and doing more necessarily. It's more about how can you leverage your existing systems.
What you have. And for you, Rachel, I want to incorporate some of the questions I have in this view of the technology and innovation, because there are several questions here in terms of how Petrobras sees the opportunities not only in Brazil, but outside of Brazil. So from that perspective and in the innovation and the technology applications that you have done already in Brazil, do you see an opportunity to go somewhere else in applying them and being equally successful as you have been in Brazil, in other places?
Yeah, first of all, it's good to be the last one because I can enjoy the responses and just add some things. But just to add for the innovation, I agree with all you things, but we have to point out the tiny innovations that go on in every day on the operation system. This, because we are looking for like a highlight, something that is breakthrough, but we are seeing a lot of tiny innovations, and when we sum up, this make a lot of difference. Just to give you an example, I don't know if you're aware of, but we are still, of course, investing in oil and producing oil, but from 2015 today, we reduced 40% of the carbon intensity for every drop of oil produced in Brazil, from pre-salt to post-salt. So it's a lot.
Sure.
And if we see, I can give you examples on every kind of process in Petrobras that make the energy production more efficient, or that avoid any kind of waste, like the recycling of the platforms. Now we are in a process to abandon some of our platforms, and we're going to recycle all the materials there. So the tiny steps are also important, not all the breakthrough innovation. And to reply your question about how we Petrobras are seeing investments abroad, yeah, we have on this plan $7.9 billion of investments mainly in exploration. From Argentina, Colombia, we have two or three fields in Africa, and we are now at the position to invest on offshore oil and gas production. In Colombia's gas, we discovered recently amount of gas there, but yes, almost $8 billion investments abroad.
Great. Well, I think that we are actually out of time, and I have tried to incorporate some of your questions in the discussions we have had. So I think that I will give the questions to the specific questions to some of the members of the panel for them to follow up. But we don't have names. So I guess we will have to figure out how we get back with you in some fashion, so we can hopefully reply to your concerns. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you to each one of you panelists that have done such a great job, and I'm very grateful that you managed to be here and give us such a great overall presentation about the various segments of the energy matrix that we all depend on every single day. So thank you so much, and I want you to give an applause for each one of us.
Thank you, Benigna, and thank you to the panelists. This was a really great presentation. If you guys can get up and relax a little bit. Thank you. There's a few steps. Just be careful. I hope all of you enjoyed Brazil at a Crossroads. Certainly, this is the first, which we hope will be of many. And I thought that perhaps one way in order to really show our consideration to all of the speakers is really just to capture a few sound bites of each one of them. And some of you may not have been here in the very beginning. So bear with me here, and I hope that I'm able to capture some of the essence. But on the political side with Brian and Thiago, fascinating discussion on the outlook of the Lula administration, certainly describing to us the relationship of the administration with Congress, how decision-making is made in Congress, and also the definition of polarization and how that impacts the results in the decision-making. So some sound bites here from Brian in the early days, in the early panel there was stable, Brazil is stable but trending downward. I will remember that, Brian, wherever you are. And Thiago, one thing that really resonated with me was there are positive connections in Brazil, mostly from the private sector. I really like that because I've always believed that the private sector has a significant role in all of the economies. On the economic side, great discussion with Will and Mario. Will described to us the balance of the microeconomic aspects of Brazil. Certainly went into some of the aspects of high interest rates and currency exchange. But despite the fiscal challenges of Brazil, there are competitive sectors, and he highlighted the agribusiness and he highlighted the importance of infrastructure. Mario gave us a great summary of the tax reform. Nice thing to hear, Mario, is the incentive for green fuels that is embedded in the tax reform. And I heard really clearly simplification and easier compliance. If we, and if Brazil manages to reach that, that will be great. That will be really great. And plus, you very clearly defined the dual role of VAT being a state municipality and the federal with different timing considerations for both of them. On the energy side, I guess my glasses fell down in there, we'll see. On the energy side, Eric, thank you for describing to us the challenges of the gas sector. Some sound bites from your presentation that probably most of us didn't know, that in Brazil, solar has over 50% utilization compared to 20 to 30% in Texas. And that's fascinating. That's a really interesting, certainly the importance of transmission and infrastructure, really important for Brazil. And you highlighted the importance of the Northeast states, which also which Marina also emphasized in her presentation on how that's important, particularly for the hydrogen economy. And that's where we're seeing the Northeast of Brazil being a relatively poor region could really benefit from some of the renewables and the green agenda. Marina also emphasized the role that carbon capture may have and described the carbon market, the difference between technology-based and nature-based. So thank you. I think I will remember that. Rachel, I will always remember that last slide on the tunnel vision. That was great. That was perfect. Certainly sustainability is complex. It requires a full life cycle and systems impact analysis. It will require unprecedented collaboration for us to find the last solution there. So thank you for that. And certainly the soundbite of, in Brazil, 55% of PET is recycled versus, say, in the US, half of that. That was really encouraging. And that's probably a similar story with aluminum cans. So really important. And finally with Rechelo, Thank you, Heshelu. I noticed that many people were taking photographs of your slides, so a lot of interest. You highlighted to us the importance of the oil and gas sector, but at the same time, Petrobras willing to take risks and take some of those investments into new energy sources, building on the DNA that Petrobras has in terms of its skill set. Petrobras, as many of the private sector holders, we have shareholders that we have to report to, and you talked a little bit about the rates of return, so thank you for your transparency on that. But certainly, I close with your appreciation of the day-to-day of innovation and how that can make a change and make a difference. So with that, I hope that I was able to summarize the panels in a sufficient way. I want to thank the BRATECC and the Baker Institute staff, because without all of you, none of this would be available. From the BRATECC side, here we do have our recently elected officers, which if I may just list them: Paula as our legal advisor, Elder as our vice president. Where are you, Elder? Raul has left, but he's our corporate secretary. Eduardo Waddington, Eduardo, treasurer, came from New York City. And Michael Rinelli, he's our permanent staff, executive director. So if any of you have an opportunity to talk to them, plus the staff that helped us here, was a tremendous help. Thank you again to the sponsors, Enerflex and Asterix. And with that, we conclude this session, and we hope to see you next year. Thank you.